Chapter 26, A History of California, the American Period, by Robert Glass Cleland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26, The Central Pacific Railroad. The Pacific Railroad Bill, which closed the long struggle for a transcontinental railway, provided that the road should start on the 100th meridian between the Republican and Platte Rivers and proceed westward along the most direct, central, and practical route to the western boundary of Nevada, there to meet and connect with the line of the Central Pacific Railroad Company of California. The bill thus authorized the construction of two distinct roads. The one, designated the Union Pacific, was to reach from Omaha to the California boundary. The other, known as the Central Pacific, was to be built eastward from Sacramento until it crossed the Sierra Nevada mountains. It is the purpose of this narrative to deal only with the construction of the Central Pacific, except where the history of the two roads becomes inseparable, and to leave the fascinating but somewhat intricate affairs of the Union Pacific and Oak Ames's credit mobile to other writers. The Central Pacific found its origin in the enthusiasm of one man and owed its completion to the determination and shrewdness of four. A civil engineer named Theodore D. Judah had come to the coast in 1854 to lay out a pioneer railroad called the Sacramento Valley Line, which ran between the city of Sacramento and Folsom. Before Judah was through with this local road, he had been caught by the challenge of the Sierra and began to plan the conquest of the mountains. Within the next few years, often in the dead of winter when the snow lay 15 or 20 feet deep on the higher levels, Judah made 22 examinations of possible routes across the Sierra, and in the intervals between these trips, he tried to organize popular backing for his undertaking. The California public, so far as mere talk was concerned, was full of enthusiasm for the road, but for a long time Judah's efforts did not bring out any financial support. Footnote: A great railroad convention was held at San Francisco in 1859 at the call of the state legislature, to which every county in California, Arizona, Washington, and Oregon was requested to send delegates. Its sessions, presided over by John Bidwell, lasted for several days, but accomplished little or nothing of a practical nature. Footnote. He continued his agitation, however, as vigorously as ever, and at last secured the tangible assistance the enterprise so badly needed. This was the incorporation, June 28, 1861, of the Central Pacific Railroad Company of California, with a capital stock of 85,000 shares of a nominal value of $100 each. The officers of the new company were all engaged in business in Sacramento, and from the very beginning the Central Pacific became more of a partnership affair than a corporation. Leland Stanford, nominated but 10 days before the organization of the company for the governorship of the state by the Republican Party, and destined to win the election the following September, was chosen president. Collis P. Huntington became vice president. Mark Hopkins, treasurer, and James Bailey, a jeweler through whom Judah had become acquainted with Stanford and Huntington, became secretary. Judah himself was chosen chief engineer. The three men first mentioned, together with Charles Crocker, whose name intentionally did not appear as one of the company's directors, were in reality the Central Pacific Railroad. They afterwards became the most powerful railroad group in the West, and for nearly a generation were the controlling factor in the state's economic development. At this time, however, they were neither very rich nor very widely known, and the task to which they had put their hands was overwhelmingly great. Stanford, Hopkins, and Crocker were all born in New York, and Huntington, though a native of Connecticut, had lived most of his life in the same state. Stanford and Hopkins, as young men, were educated for the law, but Huntington and Crocker had known little schooling of any kind, except the schooling of poverty and hard work. All four reached California at the time of the gold rush, and eventually became the leading merchants of Sacramento. Stanford and Crocker were in the dry goods trade, while Huntington and Hopkins, more than a decade before, had formed a mutually satisfactory partnership to deal in hardware and miner supplies. From the time these four men joined forces in the organization of the Central Pacific until the combination was finally dissolved by death, they worked together as a unit, opposing a solid front to all opposition and never allowing personal disagreements or jealousies to defeat their purpose. This perfect teamwork largely accounted for their phenomenal success. It is remarkable, however, considering the character of the men, that they should have maintained such harmonious relations over so many years, for with the possible exception of Hopkins, all four were men of determined wills and vigorous opinions. Footnote. Huntington once said, "Crocker attended to the construction of the road, and he was a very earnest and good man. We did not agree in all things. He erred in judgment sometimes." End footnote. One of the reasons for the successful cooperation of the four was the wise division of labor very early made between them. Almost from the outset, Crocker was put in charge of the actual construction of the line. Huntington became the company's eastern representative, attending to the national legislation, purchasing material, and securing funds. Stanford handled state politics and managed the financial end in California. And Hopkins, with his keen analytical mind, served as a valuable advisor for the others, and particularly aided Stanford in local matters. When Judah presented his plan to these men in 1861 for a railroad across the Sierra, he was able to hold before them two inducements which made the enterprise less foolhardy from the financial standpoint than it seemed on its face. The first of these was a prospect of securing government subsidies of various kinds, and the second, the certainty of monopolizing the California-Nevada trade by the proposed road, even though the line should stop far short of its announced goal. This Nevada trade, at the time of the Central Pacific's inception, was a prize worth seeking. 2 years before, the great Comstock lode had been discovered in the Washoe Mountains, and a mining boom of tremendous proportions was already in progress. Nearly all the food and necessaries for the thousands who flocked to Carson City and Virginia City, as well as the tools and heavy machinery which were required for the mining operations, had to be freighted across the mountains. Literally tons of bullion were also being brought back annually to San Francisco for minting or shipment east. And in addition, the passenger traffic to and from the mines was a bonanza in itself. Some idea of the value of this Nevada business, which the organizers of the Central Pacific proposed to secure, may be seen from Judah's report in 1862 on the Placerville-Carson Road. This, the most famous stage road of Northern California, ran from Placerville by way of Johnson Pass and Kingsbury Grade to the Washoe Valley. Over it, in the year of Judah's report, 120 tons of freight were carried daily at rates varying from 6 to 8 cents a pound, yielding an annual total of $5.25 million. $500,000 additional were received from passenger fares, and Wells Fargo transported over 200,000 pounds of silver bullion not included in the figures for ordinary freight. If the Central Pacific, by building only partway across the mountains, could capture the greater part of that trade, together with that which passed over other stage roads, its directors might well afford to risk even the heavy initial cost of construction. The second inducement held out by Judah, that of federal subsidies, was of more immediate importance than even the Nevada freight, for it was manifestly impossible to provide the necessary finances for the road without some form of government assistance. In securing this federal aid, the backers of the Central Pacific were by no means disappointed, and an essential feature of the Pacific Railroad Bill, which Bailey and Judah helped to pass through Congress, was the grants of land and credits it bestowed upon the railroad companies. These were sufficient in themselves to tempt Huntington and his companions to begin actual operations. But 2 years later, by the Act of 1864, the government proved itself even more generous and materially increased the subsidies carried in the original bill of 1862. As a result of these two bills, the builders of the Central Pacific stood to receive $12,000 800 acres of government land for each mile of track constructed, and, in addition, were allowed a credit in United States 6% bonds, payable at the end of 30 years, both as to principal and interest, of from $16,000 to $48,000 per mile, depending upon the nature of the ground over which the line ran. Following the example of Congress, the California legislature also passed various measures to aid the Central Pacific, enacting as high as 7 bills in a single session on its behalf. The most important grants were made in 1864. Legislation of that year gave the company the right to issue $12 million in first mortgage 20-year 7% bonds, and provided that the state should pay the interest for 20 years on the first $1,500,000 issued, or a total of $2,100,000. A fund known as the Pacific Railroad Fund was created for this purpose by the levy of a special tax of 8 cents on each $100 of taxable property throughout the state. County subsidies were also granted to supplement those of state and nation. Placer County subscribed for $250,000 of Central Pacific stock, issuing bonds in payment, and under a similar arrangement, Sacramento County pledged $300,000. The company also obtained a valuable right-of-way, certain portions of the waterfront, and other public lands in the city of Sacramento. San Francisco, after a long struggle fought in the state legislature, at the polls, and before the courts, donated $400,000 outright to the main road and $200,000 to its subsidiary, the Western Pacific. The latter road, connecting the Central Pacific with the San Francisco Bay by way of Stockton, Niles, San Jose, and Oakland, also received valuable aid from San Joaquin and Santa Clara counties, and enjoyed besides the federal subsidies provided by the Act of 1864. Even though these various government subsidies were of princely proportions, the fate of the Central Pacific for 2 years hung in the balance. From the beginning, the enterprise was foredoomed to failure by the profits, and even its sponsors were not over-hopeful of the outcome. It was this skepticism that led Huntington to object when others planned a celebration at the laying of the first rail. Quote, "If you want to jubilate in driving the first spike here," said he, "go ahead and do it. I don't. These mountains look too ugly and I see too much work ahead. We may fail, and I want to have as few people know it as we can, and if we get up a jubilation, a little anybody can drive the first spike, but there are many months of hard labor and unrest between the first and last spike." End quote. These months of hard labor and unrest between the first and last spike, which Huntington foresaw, not caring to boast as he was putting his armor on, were even worse than the builders anticipated. The difficulties of construction, of financing, of securing material, of combating opposition, of securing favorable legislation were tremendous, and would early have staggered less resourceful or less energetic men. The route chosen by Judah, and supported by him against all subsequent attack, followed in the main the old immigrant road from Sacramento to Donner Pass by way of Auburn, Clipper Cap, and Colfax, or Illinois Town as it was then called. Footnote: Judah gave at one time 30 reasons for his choice of routes. End quote. From the summit of the mountains, the line descended along the general course of the Truckee River to the Nevada plains. A few miles beyond Colfax lay Dutch Flat, from which Judah proposed to build a wagon road to Carson Valley, thus diverting the Nevada traffic to the Central Pacific, until the railroad could be completed to the California boundary. The selection of this route led to one of the first and most violent attacks on the Central Pacific. Rival lines such as the San Francisco and Washoe and the Sacramento Valley, whose history cannot be traced here, joined with an already outraged San Francisco and Placerville public to denounce the whole project. The road was dubbed the Dutch Flat Fraud, and its builders were accused of securing government subsidies for a line which they had no intention of completing across the mountains. Whether or not there was truth in these charges, the fact remains that the Central's wagon road brought to it most of the Nevada trade and enabled it to pay very large returns while still under process of construction. Rival opposition was the least of the Central's difficulties. The Sierra Nevadas opposed a barrier nearly 150 miles wide, rising at times to an elevation of 7,000 feet. To overcome this, an army of workmen and teams had to be organized, sheltered, fed, and paid. An incalculable amount of grading, filling, trestle building, cutting, and tunneling, much of the way through solid rock, had to be accomplished. Mile upon mile of snow sheds had also to be built in the higher altitudes to protect the track in the winter, so that material could later go forward for use of construction gangs hurrying the work across Nevada. The responsibility for this phase of the work fell upon Charles Crocker, who as head of the Charles Crocker Construction Company, afterward superseded by the Contract and Finance Company, was in full charge of building operations. In reality, the companies just mentioned were only the Big Four and Edwin B. Crocker operating under another name, for Huntington and his associates saw the advisability from many standpoints of keeping the road's construction in their own hands, as well as the financial advantages to be gained from such an arrangement. But unlike the Credit Mobile, which served the chief stockholders of the Union Pacific in similar capacity, the construction companies organized by the California builders, whether in connection with the Central Pacific or any of their other roads, never revealed the details of costs and profits to inquisitive congressional committees. Next to Huntington, Charles Crocker had the heaviest responsibility of the four. Upon his shoulders fell the physical burden of the undertaking. The best testimony to his ability is that, along with the chief engineer, Montague, who succeeded Judah upon the latter's death, and Strobridge, who served as superintendent of construction, he carried the road over every difficulty mountain, desert, and man could place in its way. When white labor failed or became difficult to handle, he brought in thousands of Chinese coolies and used these Crocker's pets, as they were called, without mercy to himself or them. Even the winter snows were not allowed to check his impetuous ambition. While Crocker was carrying forward the construction work, Stanford, aided by Hopkins and an occasional visit from Huntington, was adroitly handling the state and local legislation necessary to secure the subsidies mentioned in the previous paragraph. In the East, meanwhile, Huntington gave himself to three great tasks, any one of which was beyond ordinary capacity. The first was to dispose of enough Central Pacific stock and bonds to finance operations, or, failing that, to borrow sufficient money on the personal security of himself and his associates to keep the road from lagging. His genius along this line was so marked that even in the stress of the Civil War and its aftermath, he enabled the road to carry a floating debt of $7 million, for none of which it paid more than 7% per annum, though the Union Pacific was charged a much higher premium, and the common interest rates in California ranged from 2 to 3% per month. Footnote. At one time, the single house of William E. Dodge and Company held the personal notes of Huntington and his associates for $3,250,000, so confident were the New York bankers of Huntington's ability to meet the Central's obligations. In footnote. Besides financing the road, Huntington had also to keep it supplied with material. This meant the purchase of every foot of rail used in the track, of locomotives, of passenger coaches, of flat cars, spikes, powder, shovels, and all other implements from Eastern manufacturers, since California at that time had nothing in the way of steel and iron foundries, and the shipment of this material either around the Horn or across Panama. This was an especially difficult task while the war lasted. The government had prior right to most of the supplies required by the railroad, and even when cargoes could be secured, ships were not easily found. During the war, freight rates increased from $18 to $45 a ton. Marine insurance, owing to the menace of Southern privateersmen, rose from 2.5% to 10%. Railroad iron trebled in value. Locomotives, rolling stock, everything in fact the Central Pacific required had to be bought at increased prices. Even after the war, the rivalry of the Union Pacific in the market for the same material kept up the cost of rails and locomotives and made it hard to fill orders. Yet Huntington's genius overcame these difficulties and kept a steady stream of supplies flowing from the Atlantic seaboard to the construction camps in the Sierra. The following is a typical example of the methods by which Huntington accomplished his ends. In 1866, he succeeded in stealing a march on the Union Pacific in the purchase of 66,000 tons of rails, which the latter road badly needed, and at the same time defeated a threatened combine on the part of the steel mills to increase the price. To get these rails to California required a large number of vessels, so Huntington went to a gentleman named E.B. Sutton to charter the necessary bottoms. The details of this interview are best given in Huntington's own words. Quote, "I said, well, I want to get a good ship, a good steady ship, safe. I said, you go out and run around, give me a list of what you can find. He came in with 3 or 4. He said, you can have this one for so much and this one for so much. Such a price, said I, it is too high. I can't take one of these ships. I am in no hurry, said I. The ships are coming in all along. Well, he came back. He went out 3 times, and he came back with 23 ships. I got them all down whilst talking. Well, said I suddenly, I will take them. Take them, said he. Take what? Said I will take those ships if they are A1. Well, he said, I can't let you have them. I thought you wanted only one. He said, I will have to have 2 or 3 of them myself. Said I, not of these you won't. Well, those ships took about 45,000 tons of rails. Mr. Sutton told me afterward, Huntington, you would have had to pay $10 per ton at least more if I had known you wanted all those ships. That would have been $450,000. End quote. Huntington's third task in the East lay in the field of politics. At this time, or a little later, the Central Pacific maintained an agent in Washington to whom they paid a salary of $20,000 and allowed an unaudited expense account of twice that amount. But this man was only a subordinate. Huntington himself was the real director of railroad affairs in Washington. What he accomplished in this capacity was more important from the standpoint of the Central Pacific than any of his other work. Aside from the subsidies earlier granted by Congress, one of the measures of most advantage to the California Railroad was passed in 1866. By the Act of 1864, the eastern limit of the Central Pacific had been fixed 150 miles east of the California-Nevada boundary. The territory beyond that line belonged exclusively to the Union Pacific. The bill, indeed, went even farther and permitted the Union Pacific to continue its operations westward if it reached the junction point ahead of the Central Pacific. This clause was of course obnoxious to the backers of the Central, who were secretly determined to carry their line entirely across Nevada into Utah and enter Salt Lake City ahead of the Union Pacific. To object to this feature of the bill at the time, however, might have defeated the entire measure with its large subsidies from the federal government. Consequently, Huntington accepted the objectionable provision and bided his time until by the enactment of the bill in 1866, he succeeded in releasing the Central from its limitations and in obtaining the desired right to build eastward until a junction should be made with the Union Pacific. The measure was a perfectly legitimate piece of legislation and deserved the large support which it received in Congress, but Huntington had taken no chances of its defeat by rival lobbyists. In later years, in his own brusque way, he told the following incident relative to the passage of the measure. Quote, a congressman by the name of Alley from Massachusetts, when the bill passed, came over to me. He says, Huntington, he says, there must have been great corruption, great money used, or you could not have passed that bill. Well, I said to him, Mr. Alley, I am surprised to hear you talk in that way of your associates here. I am very much surprised, but I will be frank and tell you that I brought over $500,000 to use every dollar of it if necessary to pass this bill. I got a large majority of them I knew that was in favor of it without the use of $1. We still had our means and wanted to get every vote, so I went into the gallery for votes. one head after another. I sat right there. I examined the face of every man, and I'm a good judge of faces. I examined them carefully through my glass. I didn't see but one man I thought would sell his vote, and you know devilish well I didn't try that. So I didn't use $1. End quote. Of course, Huntington's ability did not always secure the enactment of favorable measures or prevent the passage of bills opposed to the Central's interest. One act, for example, was carried through Congress fixing the gauge of the road at 4 feet 8 1/2 inches, after Huntington had convinced Lincoln that 5 feet was the proper width and had secured the issuance of an executive order to that effect. But even in this case, Huntington turned defeat to his advantage and drove a satisfactory bargain with his opponents on the issue. Footnote. By a presidential decree of January 12, 1864, the western base of the Sierra Nevada mountains was officially fixed where the line of the Central Pacific crosses Arcade Creek in the Sacramento Valley. Opponents of the railroad pointed out that this decree actually moved the mountains 20 miles west of their true location, across a comparatively level plain, thus increasing the government's load to the road from $16,000 a mile to $48,000 a mile for the 20 miles involved. End footnote. With the passage of the bill permitting the Central to enter Union Pacific territory east of California, the two rivals began a headlong race unique in railroad history. In this contest, the Central was contending for a double prize. Every mile of track laid east of the Sierras brought the government subsidy of 20 sections of land and a credit of $32,000. Equally important was the revenue to be derived from the Utah traffic, if Salt Lake could be reached before the Union Pacific built so far westward as to shut its rival away from the Mormon settlements. Huntington, indeed, had set a much farther goal for the Central Pacific's eastern terminus, and later blamed the apathy and opposition of San Francisco for holding the road back, when with proper support in California, it might have reached the Green River and controlled the traffic of all Utah, Wyoming, and Idaho. Had this object been realized, one might also add the California road would have been relieved from that thorn in the flesh, the Oregon Short Line, and the building of the Southern Pacific to New Orleans and of the San Francisco-Portland line might have been delayed for many years. The stirring details of the race between the Union and Central Pacific, the one building eastward across the Nevada and Utah deserts, the other progressing westward from the Black Hills, cannot be told here at length. On the one side was a corporation backed by almost limitless resources, well entrenched in federal politics, transporting its material from a comparatively near base of supplies over its own line, and relying pretty largely upon Irish labor for construction purposes. On the other side were 4 men, by this time well enough supplied with funds, skillful as their rivals in the use of political machinery, compelled, however, to ship supplies by long sea voyages, using Chinese coolies by the thousand for grading, track laying, and the innumerable tasks of railroad building, maintaining a secret watch over their rivals' affairs, hoodwinking the agents he sent out, stripping the markets wherever possible of material to force the Union's construction crews to stand idle, and obtaining government bonds for 60 miles of track to which their opponents laid claim. Around these elements centered the greatest race in the history of railroad construction. The two roads met at Promontory Point in Utah, an insignificant place some 53 miles west of Ogden. Here, on the 10th of May, 1869, in the presence of 1,000 spectators, the two tracks were joined. Silver and gold spikes were driven in a silver-bound tie of California laurel. Speeches were made. An engine from the east touched front with an engine from the west, and the old dream of linking the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans became a reality. Quote, "Sir," said the telegram sent by the participating officials of the two roads to President Grant, "we have the honor to report that the last rail is laid, the last spike is driven. The Pacific Railroad is finished." End quote. Finished, too, for California was much that had made her previous history. Slow-going ox wagons no longer crossed the Sierra. The mining counties dwindled in population, while the agricultural regions in the cities took on increasing life. Great land grants of early days were gradually broken up to make room for a rapidly enlarged population. The cattle baron retired to the foothills and out-of-the-way valleys to make way for grain fields, orchards, and vineyards. The San Joaquin and Sacramento valleys began to fulfill the old prophecies that one day they would become the granary of the Pacific. California products made their appearance in eastern markets, and eastern tourists daily enriched the California merchants. Travel became a source of unity and culture. Thousands of persons, long stranded on the coast because of the difficult overland journey, rushed eagerly back to their old homes in the States, and after a brief stay rushed even more eagerly back to the West, tenfold more enthusiastic for California than ever they had been before. Real estate booms grew to be familiar phenomena. Labor problems thrust themselves upon the public notice. The state government failed more and more to meet the demands of its citizens. Society and business became more complex. On every side, new forces, social, economic, and political, marked the development of a new day. In this period of transition, the builders of the Central Pacific played a foremost part, for their celebration at Promontory Point was for them the beginning rather than the end of a great task. The line from Sacramento to Ogden was only a single link in a great system yet to be constructed. By means of the Western Pacific, a line running from Sacramento to San Jose, with a branch from Niles to San Francisco Bay, known as the San Francisco, Oakland, and Alameda Railroad, the Central had an outlet to Tidewater. Later, the road got control of most of the Oakland waterfront and sought to occupy Yerba Buena Island. Deeming it necessary to control every avenue of approach to the city of San Francisco, the Central next absorbed the California Pacific, which ran from Sacramento to Vallejo and carried it on to Benicia, where ferry connections were established with Port Costa, thus forestalling any competition from that approach to San Francisco. Similarly, the San Francisco and San Jose Railroad, which had been built down the peninsula largely through subsidies provided by the two cities whose name it bore, passed under control of the Central directors and completed the desired monopoly of San Francisco trade. The process was aided by a grant from the state legislature of 60 acres of land for terminal facilities on the shore of Mission Bay. While these local developments were in progress, the Central Pacific found itself threatened in two dangerous quarters. The Union Pacific, stopped at Ogden by the Central from proceeding to California, sought an outlet to the Pacific by way of Portland. The building of the Oregon Short Line thus threatened to divert from the Central most of the Oriental trade. By running a line of steamers from Portland to San Francisco, a still more serious menace, the Union Pacific might even take over a large share of the California traffic to the east, unless the Central in some way could protect itself. But this was not the most serious menace the California Railroad had to face. Before the Civil War, the best judgment of the country, as shown in a previous chapter, favored the extreme southern route for the Pacific Railroad. The proposed line along the 35th parallel was also highly recommended. The war checked, but did not kill the interest in these two routes, and before the Central Pacific itself was well established, other companies were at work to build into California along both of these more southerly routes. Should a road reach the Pacific over either route, it meant incalculable loss to the Central, because the latter's long haul across the Sierra with the heavy grades and winding track made competition with the southern road impossible on anything like equal terms. But the men who had shown sufficient mettle to construct the Central Pacific were not now likely to see it overwhelmed by more recent rivals, and with characteristic energy they set to work to master the situation. The menace of the Oregon Short Line was met by the construction of a road from San Francisco to Portland through the Sacramento Valley. This line, originally called the Oregon-California Railroad, followed the general course of the Williamson-Abbott Survey through northern California and southern Oregon. Most of the road was built by the Contract and Finance Company of Central Pacific fame, and, as in the case of the Central, The line was largely financed by government subsidies of land and bonds. It was completed to Ashland, Oregon, the terminus of the Portland Division, in 1887. Some years before the Oregon connection was established, moreover, the Central builders had completed a much more comprehensive and daring program in the South. Here, their ambition was threefold: to monopolize the transportation business of Central and Southern California, where agricultural development foretold enormous freights, to close the eastern border of the state to rival lines, or failing this, to keep them south of the Tehachapi and to secure for themselves a through road to the east, independent of the Union Pacific and without the handicap of the Sierra. Incidentally, too, the prospect of acquiring some tens of thousands of acres of rich agricultural land was not altogether without its weight. To realize these ambitions required the construction of an entire railroad system. One of the first measures was to make sure of the San Joaquin Valley. This was done by absorbing a number of independent lines and constructing sufficient mileage to give a through track from Lathrop on the Central Pacific to a place known as Goshen in the northwestern corner of Tulare County. By the time this was done, a new road, which had made an insignificant beginning in 1865, began to attract a great deal of public interest through the coast counties south of San Francisco. This was the Southern Pacific Railroad Company of California, and like the mustard seed mentioned in the scriptures, from being one of the least of California roads, it was soon destined to become the greatest. The original charter of the Southern Pacific called for a road along the coast, following pretty closely Park's survey from San Jose to San Diego. Thence the line was to run to the Colorado, where a junction was planned with the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, which Congress had authorized along the line of the 35th parallel. By the acquisition of the San Francisco-San Jose Railroad, which by this time had reached Gilroy in the Salinas Valley, and by showing an apparent intention of continuing down the coast in keeping with the provisions of its charter, the Southern Pacific for a time appeared in the guise of a formidable rival to the Central's monopoly. This hope was short-lived. As early as 1867, the Southern Pacific had announced a change from its proposed route down the coast to a line across the mountains into the San Joaquin and on to the Colorado by way of the Tehachapi. This radical departure from the original plan, though greeted with strong opposition from many quarters, especially in the coast counties most seriously affected, was approved by Congress. The latter body also granted the Southern Pacific the privilege of building a branch from its proposed Tehachapi, Colorado line to Los Angeles, and of continuing this by way of the San Gorgonio Pass to Fort Yuma. Two short extensions of its line from Gilroy, the one running to Soledad in Monterey County and the other to Tres Pinos in Benito County, put the Southern Pacific in a position to block the approach of any rival coming up from the south along the coast. As its congressional grant gave it the right of connecting at Needles and Yuma with the two through roads from the east, it was only necessary for the Central and Southern Pacific to unite to complete the railroad monopoly of California. By 1871, when the Contract and Finance Company undertook the construction of the Southern Pacific line from Gilroy to Fort Mojave, it was clearly understood that this merger had taken place, and that Stanford and Company, as the Big Four were generally spoken of in California, had effectively killed all hopes of the Southern Pacific standing out as an independent road. Beginning at Goshen, where the Central Pacific stopped, the Southern Pacific's tracks were laid through Williamson's favorite pass, the Tehachapi, and thence extended to the Colorado. Control of one of the southern transcontinental routes was thus assured so far as an entrance into California was concerned. But the real test was yet to come. A road known as the Texas Pacific was already under construction westward from New Orleans along the 32nd parallel. To meet this road at Yuma was not sufficient. The Southern Pacific must be carried on through Arizona and Texas to become a transcontinental road in its own right. The fulfillment of this ambition was largely due to Huntington's determination, for his companions regarded the undertaking with apprehension and gave it something less than wholehearted support. Opposed to Huntington was Thomas A. Scott of the Texas Pacific, who was seeking to extend his own road to the California line. To succeed in this, he must obtain government aid in the form of land grants and federal bonds. Huntington used all the skill he could muster to defeat this grant, and adroitly showed up Scott's previous record when the latter sought to win the support of Congress on the ground that he was a public benefactor. To embarrass his rival further, Huntington even offered to build the Southern Pacific without federal subsidy of any kind. Footnote. Huntington, however, counted upon substantial subsidies from the legislatures of the territories through which the road ran. End footnote. In these and in other ways, he successfully defeated Scott's plans for the Texas Pacific and was able to carry out the program for his own line. While Huntington was thus engaged in checkmating Scott in Washington, the rails of the Southern Pacific, in the face of a government order to the contrary, were hurried through to the Yuma Indian Reservation and over the Colorado. Work was then rushed across Arizona and New Mexico to El Paso. The line was finally built almost to the Louisiana boundary, where connection was made with a road running into New Orleans, which the Southern Pacific directors acquired from the Morgan interests. Thus, the California Railroad at last reached its long-coveted outlet to the Gulf and made direct connection with eastern markets. From the California boundary to New Orleans, however, the line was still known by various names and operated, nominally, by as many separate corporations. To simplify the management and bring all the roads, both within the state and beyond its boundaries, under one head, Huntington and his associates afterwards formed a corporation known as the Southern Pacific Company. This was chartered by the state of Kentucky in 1884, and by stock ownership and lease has since controlled the combined properties of the Central and Southern Pacific Railroad companies. This chapter has shown in sufficient detail how four surprisingly able men, Huntington, Stanford, Crocker, and Hopkins, built the first great railroad systems of the state. It is a truism to say that the railroads did more than any other human factor for the economic development of California. Yet, for various reasons, the generation that witnessed the construction of the Central and Southern Pacific Railroads accorded to the founders of those great enterprises more of censure than of admiration. The reasons for this unfavorable attitude will appear in part in the following chapters. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of A History of California by Robert Glass Cleland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. The Discontented Seventies. The building of the Central Pacific Railroad overcame some of the most serious transportation difficulties of California, but it left unsolved and in certain notable instances greatly increased many of the vexatious political and social problems of the state. Indeed, for more than a decade after the railroad's completion, a deep current of popular discontent ran beneath the whole course of California history. Conditions in general were favorable to the creation of this spirit of unrest and dissatisfaction. The economic life of the state was still undergoing a process of readjustment incident to the close of the bonanza period of 1849. Industry and agriculture were not yet sufficiently developed to absorb the surplus population. Capital was scarce and interest rates almost prohibitive so far as the small merchant and rancher was concerned. Wages had fallen to a comparatively low level, and a large influx of population to the cities had given rise to grave problems of poverty and unemployment. The rural communities were as discontented as the cities. Ranching in California was essentially different from farming in the East, and even where inexperience and ignorance did not result in failure and distress, some whim of nature, such as drought or flood, occasionally ruined the crops and brought discouragement and discontent. There was seldom a reserve of capital with which to tide over such disaster to the next harvest, and crop failure consequently often meant the loss of the land as well as of the money and time invested. Land titles were uncertain, and often the subject of expensive litigation which the ordinary rancher could not afford. Only a few of the agricultural products which now rank as the most valuable of the state were then grown on a commercial scale, and the industry as a whole was not yet out of the experimental stage. The knowledge of the best methods of irrigation was still in its infancy, and the question of water rights had not yet been stripped of confusion by adequate legislation and judicial interpretation. Altogether, therefore, the lot of the small rancher was not such as to make him a satisfied and contented man. He, like his fellow citizens in the towns and cities, was inclined to radicalism. Yet Edmund Burke, in substance, once said that no Englishman cared a fig for abstract liberty, but would move heaven and earth for the concrete right of voting his own taxes. So, in California, the political discontent and popular unrest of the 70s did not arise alone from a general sense of grievance, but was also the product of very definite factors, the effect of which men felt in the practical affairs of everyday life. When, therefore, late in the decade, the citizens demanded a new constitution for the state, they were thinking much less of the rights of man, though out of respect for tradition they had to say something of those too, than they were of certain very specific and concrete practices to which they traced many of their material ills. The chief of these grievances had to do with corruption and inefficiency in government, the evils of the railroad situation and the political activities of the Central Pacific, large land and water monopolies accompanied by unfair methods of taxation, wages and conditions of labor, and finally unrestricted immigration of Chinese coolies. The bill of particulars was large. It remained to be seen how far these evils could be eradicated. One of the most serious of the problems was that of government reform. Never in the history of the state had political standards been quite so demoralized, and the responsibility of public office so lightly felt. The nation itself during this decade was passing through a period of political laxness, of which such scandals as the Credit Mobile, the Indian frauds, and the whiskey ring were merely symptomatic. New York was giving to the world the inspiring example of the Tweed ring. The Gould-Fisk combination was playing fast and loose with the welfare of great railroad systems, attempting to corner the nation's gold by control of cabinet officials, and insolently damning the public in the bargain. In business and in politics, the whole country was suffering the worst moral collapse it has yet experienced. George F. Hoar's indictment of the period, severe as it was, contained nothing of exaggeration. On May 6, 1876, he made this statement in the Senate, quote, "My own public life has been a very brief and insignificant one, extending little beyond the duration of a single term of senatorial office. But in that brief period I have seen 5 judges of a high court of the United States driven from office by threats of impeachment for corruption or maladministration. I have seen in the state in the Union foremost in power and wealth 4 judges of her courts impeached for corruption, and the political administration of her chief city become a disgrace and a byword throughout the world. I have seen the chairman of the Committee on Military Affairs in the House rise in his place and demand the expulsion of 4 of his associates for making sale of their official privilege of selecting the youths to be educated at our great military school. When the greatest railroad of the world, binding together the continent and uniting the 2 great seas which wash our shores, was finished, I have seen our national triumph and exultation turned to bitterness and shame by the unanimous reports of 3 committees of Congress, 2 of the House and 1 here, that every step of that mighty enterprise had been taken in fraud. I have heard in highest places the shameless doctrine avowed by men grown old in public office, that the true way by which power could be gained in the Republic is to bribe the people with the offices created for their service, and the true end for which it should be used when gained is the promotion of selfish ambition and the gratification of personal revenge. I have heard that suspicion haunts the footsteps of the trusted companions of the President." End quote. As already intimated, California politics in the period under discussion suffered from the same ills which Hoar found in the national capital and in New York. No branch of the state government was free from this low tone of political morality, but it was generally recognized that the legislature was more completely lost to a sense of political honor than any of the other departments. There were several reasons for this condition, apart from the general factors of corruption and inefficiency inseparably connected with all legislative bodies. The California legislature, unfortunately, had behind it no tradition of honest government. On the contrary, almost from the organization of the state, its proceedings had been marked by a moral laxness that frequently assumed the proportions of open scandal. Therefore, whenever the body came together, lobbyist and corrupt agent of every sort flocked to the state capitol, where a man with money or favors at his command might do much to influence legislation. Again, the members of the legislature too frequently united second-rate ability with second-rate morals, and as the Constitution, naively framed on the supposition that public officials could safely be trusted with power, imposed few restraints on the law-making power of the body, and the combination was exceedingly injurious to the state. Complaint was made particularly against the free hand allowed the legislature in levying taxes, making appropriations, granting away franchises and state lands, and enacting special legislation. Even where no dishonesty prevailed, the organization of the legislature and its methods of doing business led to the enactment of hurried and ill-digested laws, most of which were crowded through in the last few days of the session, allowing all sorts of private interests to profit at the expense of the public good. William J. Shaw, a member of the California Senate, made the following trenchant criticism of these conditions in 1875. Quote, "It is really difficult to comprehend how a legislature could be intelligently contrived to render it more certain that proper legislation cannot possibly be performed. The last session ended on the 30th of March, 1874. In December, our legislature passed 13 statutes. In January, it passed 39. In February, it passed 109. In its 30 days in March, it passed 518 statutes. But we have not yet told all. Of the 679 statutes, no less than 518 were merely local or personal acts, and of no moment to the state at large. No less than 32 were passed to permit county sheriffs or clerks to leave the state, or for the private interests of some persons in the way of getting money claims allowed, justly or unjustly. 9 separate statutes were passed to enable school districts to build schoolhouses, or to do something else of a like local nature. 1 statute was enacted to change the orthography of an unknown place, and 2 or more to change the names of some such places. 3 several statutes were passed to prohibit hogs from running about in some of the counties, and 1 to prevent horn cattle. Several separate statutes were passed to make counties pay debts they apparently were not obligated to pay otherwise. 1 special statute was passed to authorize the county government of San Francisco to hire a messenger, and, I believe, 1 other to enable it to better provide for removing dead dogs from its streets. No less than 13 several statutes were passed at the last session and approved by the governor to repeal or amend 13 other statutes previously passed and approved by the governor at that very same session, so that even before the 103 working days had passed by, they found it necessary to begin again to repeal or amend some of the very acts the houses had just passed and the governor had just approved only a few hours or a few days previously." End quote. Dishonesty, mediocrity, and confusion thus combined to make the California legislature an easy prey to many species of corrupt politics. Independent newspapers characterized session after session of the body as extravagant, useless, and corrupt. Outright bribery was so common that the San Francisco Bulletin, without any trace of sarcasm, congratulated the people of the state because the members of the legislature during one session, even though evincing ignorance and incapacity, seemed to be influenced in their support of objectionable bills more by political prejudice and personal ambition than by mercenary motives. What was true of conditions at Sacramento was also true of the politics of San Francisco. The salutary lessons taught by the vigilance movement of 1853 had been forgotten, and the city officials, though no longer so openly in league with cutthroats and similar gentry, had formed a highly profitable partnership with certain contractors and public utility corporations of various kinds. The award of municipal contracts, the paving of city streets, the erection of public buildings, and the various kindred enterprises offered rare opportunities for exploitation of the city's funds. Quote, "Our official rascals may be set down as the meanest in America," said one San Francisco editor. "There appears to be nothing too small for them to appropriate. They go for everything in sight, from a horse and a buggy to the shirt studs of a suicide. Everybody who has any dealings with the city has to grease the wheels. The city hall needs reformation almost as badly as the most notorious dive on the Barbary Coast. Faster than we can make note of them or take account of them, rogues are being discovered." End quote. The truth was, the whole political situation of California, as evidenced by the conditions both at Sacramento and in San Francisco, was unfortunately bad. The concrete effects of these evils in government appeared in increased taxes, unjust assessments, poor streets, high railroad rates, water monopolies, and in a score of other abuses which brought home to the average citizen the significance of government. He became interested in reform, not as a political philosopher, but because he wanted to save money. Inseparably connected with political abuses were grievances of economic origin. Foremost of these were the issues arising out of the transportation monopoly. The Act of 1861, incorporating the Central Pacific, had fixed a maximum passenger fare of 10 cents a mile and a maximum freight rate of 15 cents per ton-mile. Within these limits, however, the sole method of determining rates was to charge as much as the traffic would bear, and perhaps a little more. Time and again, the legislature had been importuned to enact a full schedule of freight and passenger rates to which the railroads would have to conform. But the Central Pacific officials denied the power of the state to pass such legislation and effectually killed all bills of the kind. Whether rates as a whole were extortionate or reasonable is not now a vital question. In spite of repeated denials, accompanied by plausible figures that the California roads were yielding a profit or charged proportionately more than Eastern lines, public opinion stubbornly took the other view. To the people of that day, the swollen fortunes of the builders of the Central Pacific was evidence enough of the revenue-producing powers of the road. Moreover, the assertion that rates were much lower by rail than in the days of the stagecoach, that goods were carried much more quickly, and that land through which the railway ran had greatly enhanced in value, failed to convince the California public that the road was indeed a great public benefactor entitled to practice any methods it might choose. There were also many features of a technical nature connected with fixing of railroad rates, which the public of that day could not fathom, and in which they saw only great injustice. For example, it is doubtful if many of the ranchers of the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys could understand why it cost them more to ship barley 100 miles by rail to Tidewater than to send it all the way from San Francisco to Liverpool on a British vessel. Similarly, an alfalfa grower of Kern County had difficulty in comprehending the necessity of paying $180 for the shipment of a carload of alfalfa seed when an equal weight of wheat would be carried the same distance for $60. The city of Winnemucca, Nevada, lies east of the Sierra Nevada mountains and is about 400 miles nearer Chicago than San Francisco. Yet the freight rate from Chicago to Winnemucca was 2 1/3 times as great as the rate from Chicago to San Francisco by way of Winnemucca. The reasoning by which the railroad justified this practice was not convincing to inland shippers. The principles upon which most of these discriminations were based, for example, that of the long and short haul and the lower rates for tidewater points, have since been settled in favor of the railroads. But at that time they were an effective source of aggravation to thousands of shippers and cost the railroads heavily in public favor. Other practices, legitimate neither then nor now, were just as freely, if not quite so openly, indulged in, to the further unpopularity of the railroad and the real harm of the public. Uniform freight rates and service prevailed only in theory, and were determined largely by the relation of the individual shipper to the road. The Central Pacific was charged with granting rebates, discriminating between shippers in the allotment of cars, manipulating service to injure or favor some particular patron or community, and otherwise abusing the tremendous power which its monopoly of the state's transportation facilities conferred upon it. Suits brought against the railroad for real or fancied injuries seldom netted the plaintiff anything but loss. The most capable lawyers of the state were in the employ of the Central Pacific, and it was natural that the road should have a tremendous advantage in dealing with an individual opponent. Unless the latter were gifted with unusual resources, he could scarcely survive the delays, appeals, and endless technical obstacles which the company could obstruct his suit, even though the legal advantages were on his side. The success of the railroad in obtaining favorable decisions was not credited by the common opinion, however, entirely to the ability of its legal staff, for there was a feeling abroad in the 70s that judges, as well as legislatures, could be bent to do the Central Pacific's will. In the matter of taxes, the railroad also gave offense. Owing to the limitations of space, this subject, like many others in the chapter, can only be touched upon. Public opinion on it was pretty well summed up, however, by Volney E. Howard before the State Constitutional Convention of 1878. Quote, "It is said by Mr. Stanford," Howard remarked, "that the railroads pay $500,000 in taxes, and it is shown by their official documents and reports that, if they were taxed as other people are taxed on the value of the property, that they would pay annually over $3 million. But they are not taxed as other people are taxed. In my county and in others, they elect the assessor, and in my county the road that cost on an average of $25,000 per mile to build was assessed at $6,000 a mile. And land which they are selling sometimes for $10 per acre, which they received in subsidy from the government, they have taxed at $1 per acre." End quote. For these and other reasons, the Central Pacific became the object of bitter and deep-rooted hostility in California, and men came to ascribe to it the responsibility for most of the hurtful economic and political conditions from which they suffered. Another source of popular discontent in the 70s was the large landholdings, which in some sections of the state reached the proportions of actual monopolies. Aside from the railroad grants, to be spoken of later, this land problem was largely a heritage from the old Spanish-Mexican period. The sparse population and limitless extent of unoccupied territory, together with the peculiar demands of a cattle-raising people, encouraged a system of princely holdings in the California of early days. The Mexican government was most liberal in its grants to individuals, and the secularization of the missions also threw enormous areas into private hands. Thus, by 1846, it was estimated that 8 million acres were held by 800 grantees. When the first rush to the gold fields started, the newcomers paid little attention to these large holdings of agricultural and grazing lands. But before long, squatters and rival claimants began to throw the old system into utmost confusion. Title to many of the grants had not been perfected. Others were fraudulently held, and in the case of nearly all, indefinite or carelessly drawn boundaries caused serious overlapping and left large areas in dispute. As population increased and mining ceased to absorb general attention, the settlement of these perplexing agrarian questions became vital to public interest. In 1849 and again in 1850, following investigations ordered by the government, reports were sent to Washington on the subject of California titles. Congress, however, could not agree on any settled policy with regard to the California lands until 1851. In that year, after a deal of wrangling, the famous Land Act of March 3 was enacted. The bill created a board of land commissioners before whom the grantees under the old Spanish-Mexican regime were required to appear with witnesses and documents to establish ownership. Failure to meet this requirement within a specified time caused forfeiture of title. As this act worked out, it was in reality a violation of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, one provision of which guaranteed that property held in the ceded Mexican territory would be inviolably respected by the United States. Under the bill, however, these titles were thrown into the utmost uncertainty, and endless litigation followed the attempts of the Commission to adjudicate the cases brought before it. Its decisions affected nearly 13 million acres, and as appeals could be carried from the Commission to the United States courts, more than 30 years went by before many of the claims were settled. In the meanwhile, two classes of persons suffered. The native Californians, original holders of the grants, were robbed by squatters, squeezed by shrewd businessmen who lent them money at 2 or 3% a month with which to meet the costs of litigation and other demands for ready cash, and defrauded right and left by designing lawyers. But the native Californians were not the only sufferers. Small settlers, men who had but little capital, found land investments dangerous because titles were so insecure. Frequently, those who bought small tracts in good faith were driven off by some more powerful claimant or compelled to exhaust their last resources in the courts to retain possession, only in the end to see house, ranch, and improvements pass into other hands. Under these conditions, agricultural advancement was slow. Needed improvements such as irrigation works could not be undertaken on a large scale. And worst of all, the land passed into the hand of speculators whose wealth enabled them to defend their holdings before the law and to keep them intact until increasing population brought enhanced values. Large holdings were also made possible by the methods employed by the federal government in disposing of its public lands. While sound enough in theory, these lent themselves to various kinds of fraud and evasion by which the speculator profited at the expense of the actual settler. The state also aided the monopolist both to its own serious loss and the hurt of the small rancher. California, like many other western states, had received princely gifts of land at various times from the federal government. These included swamp and overflowed lands within the state boundary, so-called school lands, consisting of every 16th and 35th section of the federal domain in California, and various minor grants for a state university, an agricultural college, and other public purposes. All told, the state thus received from the federal government nearly 9 million acres of public land. It was intended that this land should be sold to actual settlers for a fixed price of $1.25 an acre, and while a good share of it was thus actually disposed of, far too much passed into the hands of large owners, commonly dubbed land hogs. First and last, the government also granted to the pioneer railroads of the state some 15 million acres of California land. Much of this was of little value, but other portions lay in the richest sections of the state. The prices on this land nominally ranged from $2.50 to $10 an acre, but the railroad builders were accused of keeping the most valuable land off the market entirely, selling it to speculators, and buying it in themselves to hold for future profit. On top of this were innumerable disputes between the railroads and those settlers who had preempted government land along the company's right-of-way. The culmination of these controversies was a pitched battle between the regular officers of the law, representing the Southern Pacific, and a group of desperate ranchers at a place called Muscle Slough in Tulare County. The engagement resulted in the death of several persons and created an animosity against the railroad which a generation has scarcely effaced. The land monopoly resulting from the various factors just enumerated weighed heavily upon the people of California. Holdings covering 500,000 acres were not unknown, and many counties were almost swallowed up by the possessions of a single company. A careful writer, A. N. Young, has estimated that half the available agricultural land in the state was thus held by only 1/500th of the population. The popular dissatisfaction which arose from this condition was aggravated by methods of tax assessment which placed a much lower valuation per acre upon land owned in large tracts than upon that belonging to small owners, or allowed the large holdings to escape assessment altogether. In most sections, the irrigation problem was also an acute grievance of the small rancher. Without water, his land was worthless. To build canals and other necessary irrigation works demanded large capital. This the settler could not command by himself, and as the formation of mutual companies was slow, the large landholders generally got control of the available water supplies and extracted high rates from the small users, or forced them to relinquish outright whatever land they had acquired. The evils resulting from this agrarian situation were undoubtedly magnified by those who suffered from it. Not every large landowner had come by his property dishonestly, or enriched himself at the expense of society. Much of the land held in large tracts, particularly a goodly share of the railroad grants, as already stated, was of so little value that no one would purchase it at any price. Yet, unquestionably, the system was bad in itself, and worked a great injustice to individuals and to the state. Not the least significant of its effects was the aggravation of the public mind and the stimulation of popular discontent. Quote, "It is the land monopolist," said J. M. Days in the state legislature in 1875, speaking for most of his fellows, "who gathers toll everywhere and puts a blight on everything. He holds millions of acres of uncultivated land, refusing to sell except at an enormous price. He pays comparatively no taxes, shifting the burden on industry. He drives the poor into cities to compete with one another for bread." End quote. As though abuses in government, the railroad monopoly, and the land situation were not sufficient to unsettle California politics and render public opinion impatient, a business depression set in about 1875, caused chiefly by the Great Panic in the East 2 years before, and aggravated by a wild period of local speculation in mining stocks, which centered in the Nevada silver companies. The collapse of this excitement was sudden and complete, and for a long time the air was filled with the debris of broken fortunes. Drought added to the general gloom, entailing a loss of $20 million to farmers and cattlemen in a single season. The distress of these years in the rural communities was greatly accentuated by unemployment and poverty in the cities. This was particularly true of conditions in San Francisco, where the industrial depression was most keenly felt. By this time, the city had a population of some 200,000 persons. Among these were miners who had drifted in from mountains with the closing down of the mines, and all sorts of industrial laborers thrown out of employment by the hard times. The Irish element was large, and labor unions had already begun to teach the working men the advantages of solidarity and the power of political action. To the other grievances of the laboring population, which embraced the sins of capitalism in general, was added the more tangible evil of Chinese immigration. To go into a detailed discussion of the Chinese invasion of California is impossible at this time. The Celestial Coolie has enjoyed more publicity than almost any other subject of California history, and if one should start to narrate his career on the Pacific coast in anything like a comprehensive fashion, there would be no end. The salient facts of the subject, however, may be briefly given. Up to 1850, a mere handful of Chinamen had come to California. By 1876, the handful had increased to 116,000, of whom perhaps 5,000 were women. There were some merchants in this number, but the overwhelming majority were common laborers or coolies, mostly from Hong Kong or other seaport cities. These coolies were brought into California chiefly by Chinese organizations known as the Six Companies, very wealthy concerns which had their headquarters in San Francisco and combined many other activities of a mercantile nature with the business of importing coolies. The Chinamen came into California under contract to pay back to the companies the price of their passage and a certain percent of their earnings. The companies in turn guaranteed to find them employment in California and to send them back, living or dead, to China. From the coolie standpoint, it is safe to say there was nothing obnoxious in any phase of the bargain. Once in California, the Chinese kept almost entirely to themselves, did not understand the white man, had no desire to associate with him, and refused to adopt his customs or manner of life. The Californian, on the other hand, saw in the Chinaman only an inferior being, simple in some ways, but cannier than a Scot in others, who lived in squalor and stench, spoke an outlandish jargon, worked with a patience and industry beyond comprehension, worshipped strange gods, suffered from strange diseases, practiced strange vices, ate strange food, regarded China as the land of the blessed, thrived under standards of living no white man could endure, administered his own law in his own way through his own agents, without much regard for the officials and statutes of the sovereign state of California, suffered with helpless stoicism whatever indignities were thrust upon him, partly because he had no vote, and represented but the far-flung skirmish line of an army of 400 million beings like unto himself. No wonder California became alarmed. The state faced irreparable injury if something were not done to keep the stream of immigration under control. The fault lay not in dealing with the problem, but in seeking to meet it with agitation and passion instead of sound statesmanship and common sense. Much legislation had already been passed before the Discontented Seventies to protect the whites against the Chinese. The foreign miners' tax made life a little more uncomfortable for the Celestials, but did not drive any large number back to China. Exclusion bills of various sorts and under various guises either failed to meet the situation, or, drastic enough to afford some actual restraint, were declared unconstitutional by the courts. The attempts to check the importation of Chinese by various forms of taxes was also tried without much avail, and municipal ordinances, many of them mere petty persecutions, similarly had little effect dealing with even the local aspects of the question. Meanwhile, the Chinamen kept coming in ever larger numbers to fill a real economic need in the state. He monopolized the laundry business, and without him most families in California would have worn dirty clothes from one week's end to another, or washed their own garments. He became the universal household servant, both in fashionable homes around the bay and in lone ranch houses where harvest crews had to be cooked for in the heat of summer over old-fashioned wood ranges. He opened cheap restaurants in every city, giving his patrons more and better prepared food than his white competitors ever dreamed of furnishing. He began to raise and peddle vegetables, to work in vineyards and orchards, to show his age-old training in building irrigation systems and reclamation canals. Finally, he was called upon by Crocker to lay the Central Pacific tracks, and from that time on did much of the unskilled construction and maintenance work for the Western railways. In the eyes of labor, however, this last arrangement increased the unpopularity of both railroads and Chinamen. It became one of the chief grounds for their denunciation of the Central Southern Pacific monopoly, and was a principal cause of much of the anti-Chinese agitation in the 70s. Another very definite ground of complaint during this period was the Burlingame Treaty of 1868. Under the terms of this agreement, whose interesting history cannot be told here, Chinamen were placed upon an equal footing in the United States with citizens of other nations. They were promised protection, offered the privilege of attending American schools, allowed freedom in their religious beliefs, and given the right to reside in the country at will. The railroad use of the coolie labor and this American negotiated treaty prepared the way for some of the most shameful incidents in California history. Anti-Chinese agitation soon took the form of violence. In Chico, San Diego, and a number of other towns, mobs from time to time destroyed Chinese laundries and restaurants. But it was chiefly in San Francisco and Los Angeles that brutality reached its climax in open murder. The worst incident of the kind was the Los Angeles Massacre of 1871. The trouble originated when two police officers, seeking to break up a Tong war in the Chinese quarter, were seriously wounded, and a third member of the squad killed outright by frenzied Chinamen. A mob of 1,000 persons, armed with pistols, guns, knives, and ropes, immediately marched into the Chinese section, seized victims without any attempt to discriminate between the innocent and the guilty, overpowered the officers of the law who were seeking to disperse the crowd, and hanged at least 22 Chinamen before the evil business came to an end. Most of the lynchings took place on Commercial and New High Streets, in what was then the very heart of the business district, and though the mob was composed of the scum and dregs of the city, no serious attempt was ever made to bring the ringleaders to justice. Though the anti-Chinese agitation never again expressed itself in quite so bloody a fashion as in the Los Angeles massacre, yet the popular outcry increased year by year. By 1875, a sort of hysteria began to sweep over the state, and the phrase, "The Chinese must go," became the battle cry of a frenzied crusade. Merchants headed their advertisements, "Our motto, the Chinese must go." A saloon keeper, speaking in the third person, exhorted his customers in the following poetic vein. Quote, "His drinks are A1 and his prices are low. His motto is always, the Chinese must go. So call on your friends, working men, if you please. Take a good solid drink and drive out the Chinese." End quote. A member of the state constitutional convention who did not believe in any waste of words introduced a bill with a single clause, "Resolved, the Chinese must go." The expression became the shibboleth of every second-rate office seeker in the state and was effectively used to appeal to prejudice and the mob spirit. This, of course, does not mean that all anti-Chinese feeling was founded on ignorance or class hate. Intelligent, sober-minded men, both among working men and employers, realized the seriousness of the problem and sought to deal with it on a rational basis. A congressional commission, state legislative committees, all sorts of organizations, and scores of individuals set to work to collect statistics and information regarding the Chinese at home and in the United States. And though much of the data thus obtained was prejudiced and unreliable, it served the purpose at least of thoroughly airing every side of the question. With the railroad monopoly, the land monopoly, hard times, unequal taxes, a government in which the people had little faith, lack of employment, and the Chinese question disaffecting the masses of labor throughout the state, a capable man might go far in organizing the radical element for dangerous action. By 1877, the situation in San Francisco had become serious, and the labor unrest found expression in such dangerous demonstrations against the Chinese residents and the property of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, as well as in such outspoken threats against the moneyed classes, that the aid of a committee of safety, headed by W.T. Coleman of vigilante fame, and the presence of 3 United States naval vessels in the harbor, were required to maintain order. These outbreaks in San Francisco occurred during July. The next month, a self-elected leader appeared to take command of the hitherto poorly organized labor movement. This man was Dennis Kearney, an Irishman 30 years of age, who had been both seaman and teamster before aspiring to political leadership. At this time, huge labor meetings were held every Sunday afternoon on a vacant sandlot on Market Street, just across from the City Hall. Here Kearney showed a remarkable genius for mass leadership. As a public speaker, he sensed the taste of his audience perfectly, and his harangues combined enough coarse humor with vigorous denunciations of capitalism in general and violent abuse of prominent business leaders in particular to make him at once a recognized favorite. Judged by his language alone, Kearney was as strong an advocate of direct action as the most rabid of modern syndicalists, but his radicalism ended there. Though he urged a little judicious hanging of capitalists and stock sharps, and called upon every workman to provide himself with a musket, there was no actual destruction of property or loss of life during his regime. Kearney, however, was not a mere spellbinder. Under his leadership, a party known as the Working Men's Party displaced a much less effective organization called the Working Men's Trade and Labor Union, which had been formed some time before and became a very powerful factor in California politics. While naturally strongest in the cities, the new party also drew from the ranks of discontented agricultural labor and even formed an effective alliance with the recently organized Granger movement among the small landholders. Its platform was remarkably free from the communistic doctrines then in vogue among the radicals, for, as so frequently happens, fortunately for society, the conservative element in the party far outnumbered the extremists and consequently gave a more moderate direction to the movement. Kearny maintained his leadership from the summer of 1877 until the following spring, but in May 1878 a hostile faction in San Francisco, headed by the party's County Central Committee, tried to read him out of control. He was formally charged with trying to establish a dictatorship, with party disloyalty and personal dishonesty, with being more than suspected of selling out to the enemy, with using indecent language and showing no respect for the rights of others, with irresponsibility and even insanity. If his opponents failed to make the bill complete, it was only through oversight. The night of May 7, 1878, the Kearny and anti-Kearny factions met at a mass meeting which proved anything but a love fest. Quote, Frank Rooney, one of the opposition, said an account in the next morning's bulletin, attempted to speak but was throttled and borne to the floor. His friends sprang to the rescue and a scene followed. The surging crowd clutched at each other's throats, gesticulating and vociferating like madmen. The sergeant-at-arms sprang into the melee, striking right and left with his commendable impartiality. The president pounded away on his desk with a police club, but no heed was given to his calls for order. Finally he called out, "Hold your ground, Rooney! Don't you go out, Rooney!" At that, the treasurer, O'Neill, went for the president, but the sergeant-at-arms properly separated them. Kearny, who was not present when the melee took place, arrived shortly after his supporters had gained control and order had been restored. Called upon for a speech, he predicted a bloody revolution and denounced the county commission. The breach in the workingmen's party, coupled perhaps with money received from certain interests he had most vigorously attacked, brought about Kearny's retirement from public notice. He had enjoyed a skyrocket sort of notoriety and made his name a source of considerable alarm to the conservative elements of society. With more education and less class prejudice, his control might have been constructive, beneficial, and long continued. As it was, though his party played a prominent part in the Constitutional Convention and filled some local offices for a number of years, its lack of effective leadership soon led to disintegration. Largely through its influence, however, the Chinese agitation was brought to a climax. Certain measures of a social and economic nature were embodied in the state constitution, and labor came to play a more important part in California politics. Incidentally, the expressions sandlot politics and Kearnyism were added to the state's political vocabulary. Enough has been said thus far to show how strong the current of discontent ran through California in the 70s. The people everywhere were seeking relief, and as the best means of getting this, demanded a new constitution. The convention to frame this document met September 28, 1878. The political makeup of the gathering was as varied as the colors of Joseph's coat. Out of the 152 members, there were 10 Democrats, 11 Republicans, 2 Independents, 78 nonpartisans, and 51 working men. The nonpartisan delegation represented a fusion of those who were willing to break away from party lines to get the best men possible. They realized that reform in the state government was necessary, but wished to keep it within bounds and give it the advantage of intelligent direction. The convention elected Joseph P. Hoag, a San Francisco lawyer, president, and Joseph A. Johnson, secretary. Its sessions lasted until March 3, 1879, when the new constitution was adopted by a vote of 120 to 15. On May 17th, the document was submitted to the people of the state and received a majority of 10,280 votes out of a total of 145,000 cast. One section of the press, under railroad and corporation influence, as bitterly denounced the convention and all its works as Kearny had denounced the San Francisco capitalists. And indeed, many of the resolutions introduced in the convention were either impractical, confiscatory, or plainly a violation of the federal Constitution. Most of these extreme measures, however, were voted down in the convention, and though many of the provisions that remained seemed reactionary to the conservatives of that day, to the present generation they appear extremely moderate. A large number of the articles failed to accomplish the good they were intended to bring about, and the intent of others was nullified by the courts, or so twisted by legislation as to serve the very evils they were designed to abolish. As a whole, however, the Constitution of 1879 was much more adapted to the needs of the state than the old Constitution of 30 years before. It is true that abuses flourished under it with all the vigor of a green bay tree, but the delegates to the convention had at least made an honest attempt to meet the needs of the time and to relieve the people of deep-seated grievances. They failed in many particulars, but in passing judgment upon them, one should remember that they were seeking to solve a perplexing variety of economic, social, and political problems with which the people of the state themselves were not qualified to deal. Even a perfect constitution would not have brought the changes men desired. These waited upon a more enlightened public opinion and on a higher order of business and political morality, rather than on new organic law. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28, A History of California, the American Period, by Robert Glass Cleland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28, Politics, 1880 to 1910. A Resume. As stated in the preceding chapter, the Constitution of 1879 made a sincere attempt to remedy the grievances of which the people of the state complained. To this end, it provided for a more equitable system of land assessment, placed the sale of water for irrigation purposes under official regulation, curtailed to some degree the right of the public service corporations to fix rates, declared lobbying a felony, forbade special legislation, and greatly restricted other powers of the Senate and Assembly. In dealing with the issues arising from the transportation monopoly, the framers of the Constitution made many radical changes in the old order. Railroads were declared common carriers and forbidden to combine with steamship lines or among themselves to hinder competition. Discrimination in rates or service was prohibited. Passes could no longer be granted to state officials. Rates, once lowered to stifle competition, could not be raised again without the sanction of the state. Finally, no officer, stockholder, or employee of a railroad was permitted to furnish supplies or material of any kind to the company with which he was connected. The most significant extension of public control over the railroads lay, however, in the constitutional provision for a state board of railroad commissioners, with ample powers to regulate rates, examine into accounts, and prevent unlawful discriminations of every sort. As formally established by the Legislative Act of April 15, 1880, this board consisted of 3 members, elected every 4 years. The creation of this commission was considered a great victory for the people, and for a time there was much rejoicing that a method had at last been found to deal with the railroad monopoly. Following the adoption of the Constitution, 30 years went by before the state experienced another startling political upheaval. In the meantime, many of the economic conditions against which the agitation of 1878 had been directed gradually disappeared. The Chinese invasion, as already explained, was checked by federal legislation. Many of the large land holdings were subdivided into small ranches and sold to meet the demands of a constantly increasing population. Water rights became more stabilized, and the development of diversified forms of agriculture improved materially the status of the rural population. From a political standpoint, however, conditions showed but slight improvement. The standards of the time tolerated many practices which present-day opinion outlaws. Moreover, the system of party organization and the electoral machinery then in vogue were not especially adapted to making the government responsive to popular control. For the most part, during this period, the state was under the control of the Republican Party, with the Democrats gaining an occasional governorship or electing an occasional United States senator. But under neither party was there much change in the fundamental conditions. "There is not much that divides the parties now," truly said Collis B. Huntington some years before his death in 1900, "but the 7 great reasons. Those are the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes." And it need scarcely be added that Huntington knew whereof he spoke. To account for the low tone of politics and government within the state, the people of California fell back upon their old antipathy to the Central Southern Pacific Railroads, whose builders had early entered the field of politics. The first concern of these men was to obtain land grants, subsidies of various kinds, franchises, and similar concessions for the roads. Later, they became interested in preventing the reduction of rates, the increase of taxes, and the enactment of various forms of regulatory legislation. In these political activities, as in every other undertaking, the railroad organization was efficient and successful. But as public sentiment grew more hostile, anti-railroad agitation began to be resorted to as an easy means of obtaining votes, and anti-railroad legislation, some of which was legitimate, some ultra-radical, and some scarcely concealed form of blackmail, had to be fought in every session of the legislature. The railroad organization was also vitally interested in the congressmen and senators California sent to Washington, and in the character of such bodies as the State Board of Railroad Commissioners and the State Board of Equalization, with its powers of revision over tax assessments. In fact, since the interests of the Southern Pacific Company were so extremely varied that it could be benefited or injured in 100 different ways by as many political bodies throughout the state, there was virtually no limit to the official appointments and legislative issues in which it was concerned. Eventually, as already stated, these political activities of the railroad came to be accepted by the people of California as the chief cause of the unsatisfactory nature of their government. The influence of the Southern Pacific machine was popularly supposed to extend from the governor of the state to the lowest ward heeler in San Francisco, and to determine who should sit in city councils and on boards of supervisors, who should be sent to the House of Representatives and to the Senate at Washington, what laws should be enacted by the legislature, and what decisions should be rendered from the bench. That the officials of the Southern Pacific could not be convicted of any direct violation of the law in their political activities made no great difference to the public mind. Men, for example, pointed to the election of Stanford to the United States Senate in 1885 as an evidence of the railroad's power, and the story got abroad that he had spent $250,000 to ensure the necessary votes. After the death of Colton, one of the important builders of the Southern Pacific Railroad, certain letters which had been written by Huntington to Colton were submitted as evidence in a suit brought by Colton's widow against her husband's former associates. Extracts from these letters, which dealt principally with Huntington's activities in Washington, the desirability of passing certain measures in the California, Arizona, and New Mexico legislatures, and the election of candidates favorable to the railroad interests, influenced the public mind still further against the Southern Pacific Company. Beginning in the early 90s, moreover, and extending over half a decade, the Southern California public, particularly, had what was commonly regarded as unmistakable evidence of the Southern Pacific's influence in national politics. The issue involved was that of constructing a deep-water harbor at San Pedro. This port, famous in the old days of the hide and tallow trade, furnished the logical outlet of Southern California railroads to the sea, and was the natural entrepot for all the territory tributary to Los Angeles. The roadstead, however, was badly exposed at certain seasons of the year, and required the erection of an expensive breakwater to render it secure. The required appropriation for this depended necessarily upon the federal government, and though a number of small appropriations for dredging the estuary, or so-called inner harbor, had been made, Congress seemed little disposed to provide the necessary funds for the larger undertaking. In the early stages of the movement, the Huntington interests, in common with other influential organizations, backed the San Pedro enterprise. Later, for reasons variously explained, the Southern Pacific broke away from its former associates, became the bitter opponent of the San Pedro appropriation, and advocated the creation of a port some 2 miles north of the town of Santa Monica, where the company itself had just erected a costly wharf, familiarly known in after years as the Long Wharf, reaching a mile out to sea. For many years, the fight over this harbor question went on, until it became the most hotly contested issue in Southern California politics. The Southern Pacific program was backed by various newspapers and a number of the most influential citizens of Los Angeles. On the other hand, the fight for San Pedro was carried on by a strong coalition composed of the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, the recently organized Los Angeles Terminal Railways, and the Los Angeles Times, of which Harrison Gray Otis, for many years the most unique figure in journalism on the Pacific Coast, had not long since become proprietor. The San Pedro cause, moreover, found an effective representative in the United States Senate in the person of Stephen M. White of Los Angeles. Few Californians in public life have enjoyed either the national distinction or the local admiration which fell to Senator White during his political career, and nothing contributed more to this popularity than his vigorous fight for the free harbor at San Pedro. Only the most general summary of the long drawn-out contest can be given here. The hearings before the committee and the speeches in Congress were filled with technical discussions of the relative merits of the two ports. Currents, prevailing winds, holding grounds, and 100 kindred subjects figured in the controversy, to the great confusion of the lay mind, and without much enlightenment to Congress. The upshot was that for 4 years neither side could gain an appreciable advantage, and the government failed to make an appropriation for either port. In 1896, however, a special board of engineers, known as the Walker Board, from Admiral John G. Walker, its chairman, was appointed to make an examination of the two ports and recommend one or the other for the congressional appropriation. After several months of investigation, this body brought in a voluminous report signed by 4 of the 5 members, in which San Pedro was favored as the location for a deepwater harbor for commerce and of refuge in Southern California. Though Congress had intended the findings of this board to be final and had authorized the actual work to begin when its decision was made, a further delay of 2 years ensued in carrying out the project. The common opinion of that day laid the blame for this upon Secretary of War Alger, who was accused of using his position to block the San Pedro enterprise at Huntington's instigation. Indeed, whatever merit the Santa Monica plan may have had, the Southern California public for the most part saw in it only an attempt of the Southern Pacific to shut other railroads away from deep water so that its monopoly might not be interfered with, and to control a great public enterprise for its own ends. Along with the public sentiment against the railroad arising from its actual or alleged political activities, went a hostility based upon economic grounds. The large landholdings of the company itself and of the individuals connected with it still remained a source of aggravation to the public mind. The rebates and discriminations which were still practiced in California as in other states increased this discontent. Particularly in the agricultural sections, men felt themselves so much at the mercy of the railroad that they became obsessed with a feeling of bitter futility, which was well summed up in the popular expression, "Out of 3 drops of rain which fall in the San Joaquin Valley, 2 are owned by Collis P. Huntington." The failure of the State Board of Railroad Commissioners, which had been so vigorously fought for in the Constitutional Convention of 1879, to order great reductions in freight and passenger rates, was especially galling to the public mind. It is true that very substantial reductions had been made from the high rates of the 70s, but these were not sufficient to satisfy the popular demand, and the Railroad Commission was looked upon as having fallen, like other political bodies, under Southern Pacific domination. The common opinion of the day regarding that body was thus expressed by S.E. Moffett, writing in 1896. Quote, "The curious fact remains that a body created 16 years ago for the sole purpose of curbing a single railroad corporation with a strong hand was found to be uniformly, without a break during all that period, its apologist and defender. Not a single majority report was ever issued from the office of the Railroad Commission of a nature unsatisfactory to the company the commission was established to control, so that the net result of the popular agitation for the new Constitution in 1878 and of the various anti-monopoly agitations since has been the creation of a new Southern Pacific Literary Bureau maintained at public expense." End quote. Though the Southern Pacific Railroad was the most outstanding object of popular suspicion and dislike, it did not have a complete monopoly of this distinction. Public service companies and large corporations generally, many of which hid behind the skirts of the Southern Pacific and profited from its political activities, came in for their share of condemnation. Writing in 1897 while mayor of San Francisco, James D. Phelan summed up the current view as follows, quote, "We have the suspected corruption of public bodies, legislators, and supervisors, and even courts are exposed to the machinations of the corporations, which, with the Southern Pacific Company, the overshadowing monopoly of the state, have been classified by the people in impotent wrath as the associated villainies. They have debauched politics and established a government within a government, more powerful in normal times than the state government itself." End quote. This hostility to the railroad and to corporation interests in general was of course not confined to California. Nor was the movement which later brought a new order of affairs in politics, established a new relation between government and corporations, and brought a change in public sentiment toward such companies, confined to the state boundaries. In California, however, there were certain influences which made this movement particularly effective. Not the least of these was the development of a large middle-class population, especially after 1900, with means, education, and leisure enough to take an active and intelligent interest in political affairs. It is almost unnecessary to add that many of these newcomers were from the Middle Western states and brought with them an instinctive desire for political experiment. Before any particular change occurred in the state government, however, the two largest cities of California underwent a pretty thorough political overhauling, and the influence of these municipal reforms very materially affected the whole state. In 1902, the government of San Francisco passed into the hands of a notorious combination known as the Roof-Schmitz regime. Though Schmitz was nominally mayor, the real leader of the organization was Abraham Roof, a man of shrewd ability but of very low political ideals. Masquerading behind the livery of the Labor Union Party, Roof and Schmitz succeeded in building up a very effective political machine, and after once attaining the office, kept the city under their control for 6 disgraceful years. The revenue which was necessary to keep the machine intact came from many sources. An organized ring in control of illegal prize fights in the city contributed liberally to the Roof-Schmitz exchequer. So also did privileged gambling houses, saloons, dens of the Barbary Coast, and more respectable establishments in other parts of the city euphemistically known as French restaurants. These, however, were not the worst aspects of the system of government from which San Francisco suffered. The more outstanding evil of the Roof-Schmitz administration was the relation between the municipal officials and certain important public services corporations within the city. These companies, like the saloons and brothels, also paid tribute to the political machine. Whether they were victims of official blackmail under which they could operate and obtain legitimate franchises only as they resorted to bribery, or whether, in order to secure privileges and immunities hurtful to the public interest, they were willing to corrupt the very springs of government, is too largely a matter of individual opinion for discussion at this time. Irrespective of where the primary guilt lay, it was obvious that the people of San Francisco were suffering in many tangible ways from a moral collapse in municipal affairs. By 1906, conditions had become so bad that a small group of citizens, including Fremont Older of the San Francisco Bulletin, Rudolph Spreckels, and James D. Phelan, set about a systematic campaign to clean up the government and punish the chief criminals. Aided by President Roosevelt, this group engaged the services of Francis J. Haney, who had just won national distinction from his prosecution of certain timber frauds in Oregon, and also of William Burns, later of the United States Secret Service. Before much headway had been made in the investigations, however, the great earthquake and fire of April 18th reduced the city to ruins and temporarily checked the reform movement. The confusion arising from the great disaster to San Francisco afforded even larger opportunities for graft than Schmidt and Roof had previously enjoyed. While the people of the stricken community, with unquenched optimism, were planning to rebuild their city on a more substantial basis, the United Railways Company, which at that time monopolized the local traction business, secured from the Board of Supervisors permission to continue operations under an overhead trolley franchise instead of installing an underground cable system similar to that in use in Washington, D.C. In this transaction, the company was charged with having paid $200,000 to secure the necessary votes. The unearthing of this and many other instances of graft by the backers of the reform program, and the prosecution of the most notorious offenders, occupied months of time and aroused the bitterest antagonism. At the very outset of the investigation, Roof sought to remove the district attorney, W. H. Langdon, an honest man who had slipped into office through inadvertence on Roof's part, and to have himself appointed to the office in Langdon's stead. Failing this, he also lost control of the grand jury, and along with Schmitz had to face indictment and trial. The supervisors, 18 in number, were completely cornered and forced to confess their part in the corruption from which the city had suffered for so many years. So long as Haney and his supporters confined their attention to Roof, Schmitz, and the supervisors, public opinion ran strongly in their favor. But with the next step, the trial of Patrick Calhoun and Thierry L. Ford of the United Railways, the graft prosecution, as the movement was now called, at once lost support in many quarters. As the trial proceeded, San Francisco experienced something of the old excitement and tenseness of vigilante days. Most of the newspapers turned against the prosecution, with a bitterness of invective rarely equaled in California journalism. Attempted intimidation gave place to actual violence. One of the supervisors, named Gallagher, whose testimony was vital to the prosecution, had his house blown up with dynamite. Fremont Older was kidnapped and carried as far south as Santa Barbara in what was believed to be an abortive attempt to bring about his assassination. Haney was shot in the head while conducting the prosecution, but escaped a mortal wound. His assailant, apparently deranged, was imprisoned and later committed suicide. For 2 years and more, the graft prosecution continued. Every technicality known to the law was made use of to save the accused men. Juries were tampered with, witnesses intimidated, and public opinion befogged. The United Railway officials escaped conviction through a divided jury and succeeded in having the remaining indictments dismissed. Officials of other public service corporations charged with similar violations of the law were never brought to trial. Schmitz was saved on a technicality by the state Supreme Court. Roof alone was sent to the penitentiary. The direct results of the attempt to punish misgovernment in San Francisco were thus disappointingly meager from the standpoint of decent citizenship. But the indirect effects of the graft prosecution were much more significant than would have been the conviction of any number of guilty citizens or corrupt officials. The evidence submitted at the trials of these men might not be sufficient to send them to prison, but it convicted them overwhelmingly in the public mind, and, more important still, laid bare the evil workings of the system which they symbolized. Through the San Francisco graft investigation, the people of the state were both enlightened and aroused. Incidentally, too, the municipal government of San Francisco, for some time after the Rufus Schmitz exposure, was honestly and efficiently administered by Mayor Taylor. In the midst of San Francisco's unsavory disclosures, similar evidences of corruption were found in the municipal government of Los Angeles. As early as 1907, it was pretty generally surmised that certain city officials, headed by Mayor A.C. Harper, were in league with the disreputable elements of the underworld. Appointments to office were made without any regard to the fitness of the individual, and often included men of notoriously evil character. The moral sense of the city was outraged, and its fears aroused lest the building of the great Owens River Aqueduct, then on foot, should lead to wholesale raids upon the municipal treasury. On January 7, 1909, Mr. T. E. Gibbon, the editor of the Los Angeles Herald, began the real reform crusade with a series of articles entitled, "Is Vice Protected in Los Angeles?" These articles were run in wide columns enclosed in red borders. Accompanying the editorials were open letters to the chief of police, giving undeniable evidence of the existence of scores of gambling centers and houses of prostitution in the city. Diagrams of the buildings where these illegal practices flourished, with almost no attempt at concealment, were skillfully added to give the needed touch of definiteness to the accusations. A clever cartoonist, with something of the art of Thomas Nast, furnished a still stronger appeal to the popular indignation. The direct connection between the violators of the law and the city administration was next revealed by the Herald's investigations. 3 sugar companies, known respectively as the Pacific Sugar Corporation, the Pacific Sugar Company, and the Pacific Securities Corporation, had been organized by the mayor and his intimate associates. Stock in the companies to a par value of $250,000 was then sold to the brewers, the saloon keepers, and the cafe proprietors holding liquor licenses throughout the city. An oil company, known as the Utah-Los Angeles Oil Company, was similarly organized and its stock marketed among the city's vicious elements, greatly to the profit of the mayor and his companions. From the standpoint of the purchasers, this stock was valuable only as its possession brought immunity from police interference. The Herald's crusade was continued until March 26th. In the meantime, the Evening Express, the Municipal League, and the district attorney joined in the campaign. A minority of the grand jury also brought in a scathing report against the city administration. As a result of these revelations, a general uprising began against Harper and all that he represented. The mayor's efforts to allay popular indignation by substituting better men for those previously appointed to the office proved futile. A recall petition was circulated, and in the ensuing election, Harper, realizing his hopeless position and fearing further disclosures, did not venture to appear as a candidate. George Alexander, formerly a county supervisor, was elected mayor, and a new era in Los Angeles politics began. The San Francisco and Los Angeles reform crusades did much to strengthen a political revolt which had started as early as 1906. Under the suggestive name of the Lincoln-Roosevelt League, this movement was formally organized in Oakland, August 1, 1907. Though nominally Republican in composition, the League had most of the characteristics of a nonpartisan movement. Its platform, as originally announced, was as follows, quote, "The emancipation of the Republican Party in California from domination by the political bureau of the Southern Pacific Railroad Company and allied interests, and the reorganization of the state committee to that end. The selection of delegates to the next Republican National Convention, pledged to vote and to work for the nominations of a candidate for president known to be truly committed to and identified with President Roosevelt's policies, and to oppose the nomination of any reactionary style safe and sane by the great corporate interests. The election of a free, honest, and capable legislature, truly representative of the common interests of the people of California. The pledging of all delegates to conventions against the iniquitous practice of trading, whereby political bosses effect nominations by bargains and sale, and the enactment of legislation penalizing such practices. The enactment by the next legislature of such laws as will give voters an advisory voice in the election of United States senators until such time as an amendment to the national Constitution shall make that voice direct and absolute, which amendment we favor. The pledging of the candidate for the legislature to the enactment of such a primary election law as shall afford the party voter a direct voice in the selection of party candidates." End quote. The program of the Lincoln-Roosevelt League was thus in keeping with a changed attitude toward social, economic, and political questions which was just then beginning to sweep over the United States. The old generation was rapidly passing away, and men everywhere were ready for new standards, new schemes of government, new political catchwords, and new leaders. Almost from the outset, the Lincoln-Roosevelt League gained rapid headway in California. Much of its success was due to the newspaper support which it received. In Los Angeles, the Evening Express and later the Morning Tribune aligned themselves with the new movement. Chester H. Rowell's Fresno Republican accorded something of the same infallibility in the San Joaquin Valley that Greeley's Tribune had once enjoyed in New York, also championed the League. The Sacramento Bee, the San Francisco Bulletin, the Oakland Tribune, and a dozen other newspapers in various sections of the state likewise threw themselves into the new cause with an enthusiasm in which the zeal to purify politics was perhaps not wholly divorced from the desire to increase circulation. The movement was also fortunate in finding capable and vigorous leadership. Chief of its leaders, at least in his ability to command popular support, was Hiram Johnson. The final estimate of this man's character and the place he should occupy in the state's political history must be left to the future's judgment. We of the present generation stand too close to see him in his true perspective. But whatever judgment history may finally pass upon Johnson, if indeed she finds it necessary to pass any judgment at all, friend and foe alike will admit his ability to win popular support. For nearly a decade, he dictated the course of California politics. The Lincoln-Roosevelt League, which formally merged into the Progressive Party in 1913, gained a partial control over the legislature of 1909 and won a complete victory in the election of the next year. It is doubtful if public interest in California had ever been so keenly aroused by a state election since the bitter rivalries of Broderick and Gwynn 50 years before. The campaign took on something of the character of a crusade, especially directed against the evils of the so-called machine government and the participation of corporations in politics. Because of the traditional unpopularity of the Southern Pacific Company in California, that corporation had to bear the brunt of these attacks, and to the great majority of voters the campaign became simply a concerted movement to drive the Southern Pacific out of politics and destroy the old machine. As a matter of fact, however, the Southern Pacific, even before the election approached, had ceased most of its political activities and took no part in the campaign. The following statement, recently made by one of the company's chief officials, frankly states the position of the Southern Pacific at that time. After the lapse of more than a decade since the election, it ought at least to be read in a spirit of fairness. Quote, "In time it became obvious to the managers of the company that the disadvantages of these political activities so far outbalanced any possible benefits the company would derive from them that it became the policy to discontinue whatever political activities existed, and after 1893 it was the constant effort of the company to divorce itself from its former relations to politics. This it had largely succeeded in doing prior to the time of Governor Johnson's election in 1910. In this campaign, the company took no part. Here and there, individuals who were friendly to the company would naturally continue their political efforts, and no doubt some of these cases were referred to as proof that the company was engaged in this campaign. It was fortunate that Governor Johnson's campaign, bristling with hostility to the interference of corporations in politics, and especially the Southern Pacific Company, afforded that company a most favorable opportunity for terminating its political activities, because the election of Governor Johnson was considered by the public to be a defeat for the company, and as the company was careful to avoid any possible political activity thereafter, it came to be accepted by the people of the state that the company was out of politics, a consummation welcomed by the officials of the company with great cordiality." The control of the governorship and the state legislature after 1910 gave to the Lincoln-Roosevelt leaders free scope to put their platform into practical effect. This was done with a thoroughness not usual in political affairs. Measures like the referendum, the initiative, the recall, the direct primary, and the popular election of United States senators to render the government more responsive to popular will were grafted on to the Constitution. Laws affecting conditions of labor were freely enacted. Additional powers were bestowed upon the State Railway Commission, and its jurisdiction extended over other public utility corporations throughout the state. In this fashion, the Lincoln-Roosevelt League fulfilled its pledge, and California began another stage in her political career as an American state. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29, A History of California, the American Period, by Robert Glass Cleland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29, Material Progress. Since the beginning of statehood, less than 75 years ago, the economic progress of California has been so remarkable that one cannot attempt to describe it without seeming to exaggerate. Wonders have become commonplace, and the prophecy of yesterday falls short of the reality of today. According to the federal census, the population of the state in 1850 was 92,597. 10 years later, it had risen to 379,994, and within the next decade reached 560,247. After the census of 1870, the influence of the railroad began to be strongly felt in the immigration of eastern people to California, and the population by 1880 had grown to 864,694. The closing years of the next decade witnessed, especially in Southern California, one of the strangest social phenomena in the history of the state. This was the real estate boom of 1887, or the Great Boom, as it was fittingly called by those who watched its meteoric progress and collapse. The Great Boom was the result of many factors. From the time of the completion of the Central Pacific Railroad, a consistent campaign had been carried on in the eastern states to induce people to come to the Pacific coast. The ordinary forms of commercial advertising were supplemented by a great variety of books and magazine articles descriptive of California, its climate, and resources. Charles Nordhoff, T.S. Van Dyke, John S. Hittel, and many others added their contributions to the general publicity the state was receiving. Even such books as Helen Hunt Jackson's Ramona and Robert Louis Stevenson's Silverado Squatters carried the name and fame of California across the mountains and helped to arouse an interest in the state among prospective immigrants. A paragraph from B.F. Taylor's Between the Gates, published in 1878, will illustrate the character of a certain type of these descriptions of California. Quote, "Whoever asks where Los Angeles is, to him I shall say, across a desert without wearying, beyond a mountain without climbing, where heights stand away from it, where ocean winds breathe upon it, where the gold-mounted lime hedges border it, where the flowers catch fire with beauty, among the orange groves, beside the olive trees, where the pomegranates wear calyx crowns, where the figs of Smyrna are turning, where the bananas of Honolulu are blossoming, where the chestnuts of Italy are dropping, where Sicilian lemons are ripening, where the almond trees are shining, through that alameda of walnuts and apricots, through this avenue of willows and poplars, in the vineyards 6 Sabbath days' journey across them, in the midst of a garden of 36 square miles, there is Los Angeles." Land was still relatively cheap in California, and as irrigation developed and the agricultural possibilities of the state became better known, especially the adaptability of certain favored sections to grapes and fruits, a steady stream of prospective buyers came annually from the east. Real estate companies, boards of trade, and chambers of commerce added their literature and advertisements to the publicity campaign, and by the early 80s the foundations for a boom were well laid. The chief obstacle retarding the immigrant movement was the high railroad fares from eastern points to California, and it only required a reduction of these to bring about an immediate rush of settlers to the coast. The completion of the Santa Fe Railroad in 1885 effected the desired end. In January 1886, this road withdrew from the Transcontinental Traffic Association and precipitated a rate war with the Southern Pacific between eastern cities and California. At the time this rate cutting began, tickets from Mississippi Valley points to Los Angeles cost about $125. Within a few months, this rate had been greatly reduced, and as the war went merrily on, the railroads almost carried people to California free of charge. A $5 rate from Missouri to Los Angeles remained in force for 3 months, and at least for one day during the keenest period of competition, the fare was actually lowered to $1. When the period of insanity passed, and the railroads ceased their suicidal rivalry, rates were restored to something like a normal basis. But even so, they did not again reach the high levels prevailing before the advent of the Santa Fe. In the meantime, the boom was on. Already interested in California by the attractive reports of its climate and resources, prospective settlers and tourists by the hundreds took advantage of the low rates to travel to the coast. Los Angeles and Southern California became the center of this immigration of the 80s, as San Francisco and the gold fields had been the center of the migration from 1849 to 1852. With the arrival of the newcomers, Los Angeles real estate began to rise sharply in value. The movement at first was orderly enough, but soon began to take on the worst features of an unsound and inflated boom. Before a year had passed, the boom had become a financial debauch. Most of those who took part in the speculative craze were newly arrived from the east, but many of the older residents at last caught the fever and either sold their real estate holdings at exorbitant figures, or, having lost their heads in the contagion, competed with the so-called greenhorn purchasers from the east for an opportunity to lose their money as well. Those responsible for the worst features of the boom, however, were outlanders from the Middle West, professional boomers, as they were otherwise called, who, learning of the increasing interest in California real estate, flocked into Los Angeles by the score and resorted to every conceivable device to inflate prices and stimulate sales. Highly colored literature, supposedly descriptive of the climate and resources of Southern California, was scattered broadcast all over the United States and even over Europe. Of the means employed locally to attract prospective buyers, J.M. Gwynne, who lived through the boom period and saw in person the spectacular features of the craze, thus wrote, quote, "The methods of advertising the attractions of the various tracts, subdivisions, and town sites thrown on the market, and the devices resorted to inveigle purchasers into investing were various, often ingenious, and sometimes infamous. Brass bands, street processions, free excursions and free lunches, columns of advertisements rich in description and profuse in promises that were never intended to be fulfilled, pictures of massive hotels in the course of erection, lithographs of colleges about to materialize, lotteries, the prizes in which were handsome residences or family hotels, railroads that began and ended in the imaginations of the projectors. Such were a few of the many devices resorted to attract purchasers and induce them to invest their coin." End quote. Under the stimulus of such advertising, Los Angeles lots rose from $500 in 1886 to $5,000 the next year, and nearby ranch lands increased 1,400% and 1,500% during the same period. Vast tracts formerly used for grain fields or sheep pastures were subdivided into town lots and sold at an unheard-of profit. Along the line of the Santa Fe Railroad from Los Angeles to the San Bernardino County line, a distance of 36 miles, 25 of these boom towns were started before the close of 1887. Most of these particular towns, after years of struggle to live down their sinister origin, have since become flourishing communities, but many of their contemporaries suffered a cruel fate. Some even died of bourning, and no wonder. They were laid out on mountainsides, in the sandy washes of the San Gabriel River, on rocky, sterile brushlands without water or any other requisite of habitation, and even on the dry wastes of the Mojave Desert. Wherever, indeed, the imagination of an ingenious and unscrupulous agent could conceive a town, there one was established, at least on paper, and lots literally sold by the thousands. Of the fate of these phantom towns, the following paragraph of J. M. Gwynne gives an apt account. Quote, "From a report compiled for the Los Angeles County Board of Equalization in July 1889, I find the area included in 60 towns, all of which were laid out since January 1, 1887, estimated at 79,350 acres. The total population of these 60 towns at that time, 1889, was placed at 3,350. Some of the largest of these, on paper, were without inhabitants. Carlton, containing 4,060 lots, was an unpeopled waste. Nadeau, 4,470 lots, had no inhabitants. Manchester, 2,304 lots, no inhabitants. Santiago, 2,110 lots, was a deserted village. Others still contained a small remnant of their former population. Chicago Park, containing 2,289 lots, had one inhabitant, the watchman who took care of its leading hotel. Sunset, 2,014 lots, one inhabitant, the watchman of an expensive hotel which was in the course of construction when the boom burst. The sites of a majority of the boom cities of 20 years ago have been returned to acreage, the plowshare has passed over their ruins, and barley grows in the deserted streets." End quote. The early part of 1888 marked the beginning of the end of the great boom. Prices fell even more rapidly than they had risen. The bands, barbecues, free excursions, glib auctioneers, and crowds of dupes and speculators disappeared, leaving Southern California, after a somewhat painful readjustment of its affairs, to settle down into a less spectacular but much sounder period of development. In the meantime, the state as a whole had continued its steady growth. In the decade from 1880 to 1890, the population rose from approximately 865,000 to 1,213,398. Between 1890 and 1900, the increase was much less marked, and the census of the later years showed a population of only 1,485,053. Within the next 10 years, however, immigration from the east set in on a larger scale than ever before, and by 1910 there were 2,377,549 persons living within the state. An even greater increase took place within the next decade, and the federal census of 1920 showed a population of 3,426,861. The increase of population from 1850 to 1920, approximately 3,600%, has been accompanied by a commensurate development of the state's economic resources. Most fundamental of these is the progress made in agriculture. In this industry, the state has passed through 3 stages. The pastoral area of the Spanish-Mexican regime, when cattle and sheep were almost the sole basis of wealth, was superseded shortly after American occupation by the supremacy of the grain ranches. These stretched for mile upon mile through the great Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys and along the arable coastlands between Bodega and San Diego. With the coming of the railroads, the development of irrigation, and the opening of eastern markets to California products, the grain ranches in turn gave place to fruit orchards, vineyards, alfalfa fields, truck gardens, and all the varied branches of agriculture which today flourish in the state. The early experiments of mission priests and Spanish colonists showed the wonderful congeniality of the soil and climate of California for the production of oranges, grapes, and deciduous fruits of almost every kind, and, as already indicated, sometime after American occupation, fruit orchards and vineyards began to be planted for commercial purposes. Grapes were grown, at first chiefly for the manufacture of wines and brandies. Vast tracts were set to vineyards all over the state, and the wine industry became a widely advertised feature of California life. Table grapes were also grown in a smaller way, but until a much later date, the raisin industry was represented only by the so-called dried grapes of little flavor and slight commercial value. Today, however, the production of table grapes and raisins has become one of the chief industries of the state. The central part of the San Joaquin Valley is preeminently the raisin section of California, and here, of late years especially, vineyard lands have risen surprisingly in value. Of deciduous fruits produced in California, there is almost no limit in quantity or variety. Thanks to the refrigerator car, much of the yearly crop can now be shipped to eastern markets in its natural form. But by far the larger part of the yield is either dried or canned. No section of the state can claim a monopoly of the deciduous industry, but the peach orchards of the San Joaquin Valley, the prune orchards of Santa Clara, the apricot orchards of Ventura, the apples of Watsonville and Yucaipa, the cherries of Vacaville, the pears of Antelope Valley, and the figs of Fresno and Tulare have acquired something more than ordinary reputation. One of the most valuable, and certainly the most distinctive branch of agriculture in California is the citrus industry. Owing to climatic conditions, the production of oranges and lemons is confined almost entirely to certain favored sections of Southern California, with the Lindsay, Porterville, Exeter region of the San Joaquin Valley occupying a place of less importance. The history of the citrus industry, interesting and significant as it has been, cannot be traced here at any length. Two outstanding features in its development, however, should at least be mentioned. One of these was the introduction of the Washington Navel in 1873. This, a seedless orange imported from Brazil by the United States Department of Agriculture, almost immediately found favor in California and soon displaced the seedling varieties of fruit previously in common use. For many years, the Washington Navel and the so-called Valencia Late have furnished the overwhelming bulk of the orange crop of the state. The second outstanding event in the history of the citrus industry, and without doubt the most significant contribution yet made to agricultural progress by the state, was the formation in October 1895 of the Southern California Fruit Exchange. This organization, born of the dire necessity experienced in the early years of finding some method of protection against the ruinous charges of commission agents and high freight rates, was established on a purely cooperative basis among the orange and lemon growers of Southern California. In 1905, the field of the organization was widened, and it took the name of the California Fruit Growers Exchange. Originally designed as a shipping and marketing agency, the exchange, as it is commonly known to its members, is today active in every department of the business. The intelligent cooperation and business efficiency which made its early success possible in the face of many difficulties and discouragements have continued to mark its progress. Until today, the organization enjoys an international reputation as the most highly developed and successful enterprise of its kind in the world. Footnote: the exchange today handles 75% of the citrus production of California, and its nationally advertised Sun-Kissed brand of oranges and lemons has become a household word throughout the United States. End footnote. The California Fruit Growers Exchange, moreover, not only made possible the success of the citrus industry of California, but also pioneered the way by which almost every other branch of agriculture in California has been lifted to a new level. Thus, the grape growers have a similarly efficient and powerful organization known as the California Associated Raisin Company. Other organizations of a kindred nature have been effected among the peach growers of the state, among the prune and apricot ranchers, and among the producers of walnuts and almonds. Vegetable and melon growers, dairymen and poultrymen in certain localities have also organized their mutual associations along similar lines. Until it may be said without danger of exaggeration that cooperative enterprise has become one of the chief secrets of California's recent phenomenal agricultural development. Another feature of the state's agricultural progress has been the steadily increasing emphasis upon the application of science to farm problems. The state university, through its many agricultural departments, has done much in this direction. The State Agricultural Society and the United States government have also contributed largely to the advance of the industry in California. In special fields, such as that of the citrus industry, the powerful cooperative organizations already spoken of have developed unusually successful departments of investigation and research for the benefit of their members. Some 16 local farm magazines, of a special or general nature, also contribute their quota to the advance of agricultural knowledge. Many rural high schools have special departments for the teaching of animal husbandry, the operation and care of farm machinery, the selection of seed and kindred subjects. Counties have their commissioners of horticulture, and there are also county farm advisors supported at public expense to advise with any rancher who may need their services and to study the local needs of their particular districts. In a word, ranching in California, as in other progressive states, has been brought to the level of a highly specialized and skilled business. Another feature of permanent significance in the state's agricultural progress has been the successful experimentation with new fruits and crops. The avocado industry, for example, though still in its beginning, promises to develop into one of the most distinctive and valuable forms of horticulture in Southern California. Long before California became a state, the adaptability of its soil and climate to cotton and rice growing has been pointed out. Yet neither of these great staples was produced in commercial quantity until very recent years. Since 1910, however, vast areas of the Imperial Valley and the San Joaquin have been planted to cotton, and the value of the crop is annually over $15 million. Rice culture, similarly, has suddenly assumed a place of first importance in the Sacramento and lower San Joaquin valleys, and California has become the second rice-producing state in the Union. The sugar beet industry, though much older than cotton or rice production in California, was still in the experimental stage as late as 1890, and only since 1900 has it risen to first-rank proportions. Bean culture has also become a distinctive California industry in recent years, and in 1918 the crop was valued at nearly $50 million. Truck gardening, for eastern as well as for local markets, has similarly been a matter of recent growth. And today, vegetables from the Imperial, San Gabriel, San Fernando, Lower San Joaquin, and Sacramento valleys, as well as from a dozen other favored sections in the state, not only supply the local needs of over 3 million people and the demands of dozens of great canneries, but also go, literally by the hundreds of trainloads, to the tables of the Atlantic seaboard and the Mississippi Valley. The cantaloupe industry, especially in the Imperial Valley and the Turlock district of the San Joaquin, has assumed astonishing proportions within the last decade, and in 1920 13,000 carloads were shipped to eastern markets. Dairying, the production of thoroughbred cattle and hogs, and the raising of poultry are also becoming of increasing importance year by year. The last named industry especially has enabled many people of small means to find an independent livelihood who otherwise would have been forced to join the ranks of the clerks or wage earners in the cities. The large-scale production of these varied types of agricultural products has been paralleled by the reclamation of great areas of swamp and overflow land, notably in the lower Sacramento and San Joaquin basins, and of even larger areas of arid or desert land by the drilling of wells and the building of irrigation works. The history of this feature of the state's development is too long to be told in this volume, but mention must at least be made of the most noteworthy enterprise of this kind in recent years. When, 150 years ago, the old Spanish colonizing expeditions crossed the Colorado River into Alta California, they found themselves in a region of sandy wastes, destitute of water, covered only with the grotesque flora of the desert, and, if the crossing were attempted in the summer, almost unbearably hot for man and beast. 3/4 of a century later, when Kearny's forces entered California from New Mexico, they found the same weary land of sand and heat stretching before them, from the Colorado to the San Diego Mountains. The following paragraph, written by Colonel Emory in 1846, is faintly descriptive of the region over which the American soldiers toiled so many years ago. Quote, "The desert over which we had passed, 90 miles from water to water, is an immense triangular plain, bounded on one side by the Colorado, on the west by the Cordilleras of California, the coast chain of mountains which now encircle us, and on the northwest by a chain of mountains running southeast and northwest. It is chiefly covered with floating sand, the surface of which, in various places, is white with diminutive spinellas, and everywhere over the whole surface is found a large and soft mussel shell." End quote. A certain Dr. Wozencraft, United States Indian agent at San Francisco from 1850 to 1860, became the first enthusiast for the development of the region, which he first visited in 1849, and afterwards described with a certain pardonable exaggeration as the most formidable of all deserts on the continent. Wozencraft labored from 1850 to 1888 to carry out his ambition, and at one time, 1859, succeeded in securing from the California legislature a grant to all state lands in the basin, providing his reclamation plan should be effected. Congress apparently was disposed to take similar favorable action when the outbreak of the Civil War ended the proposed legislation. The construction of the Southern Pacific Railway from Los Angeles to New Orleans by way of the San Gorgonio Pass and Fort Yuma stimulated a new interest in the desert region through which the line ran for so much of its course. Early in the 90s, a young engineer named C.R. Rockwood became interested in the diversion of water from the Colorado for the irrigation of the land west of the river and succeeded in enlisting some financial support. By 1896, considerable preliminary survey work had been accomplished, and a corporation known as the California Development Company had been organized under the laws of New Jersey, with A. H. Heber as its president. For 4 years, this company made little progress toward obtaining the capital necessary for the success of its enterprise. But in 1900, George Chafee, a noted engineer and capitalist of Southern California, became actively concerned with the project, and under his management, the irrigation of the valley was finally begun in the spring of 1901. The magnitude and novelty of reclaiming a desert by diverting the waters of a great river appealed to the American imagination, so that wide publicity was immediately given to the imperial undertaking. Colonists, sightseers, and speculators began to visit the valley in considerable number. And despite financial difficulties on the part of the California Development Company and internal friction among its directors, coupled with a most unfavorable report on the agricultural possibilities of the valley by the United States Department of Agriculture, a fair-sized boom was in progress by 1903. The development of the valley, though hindered by many factors, especially the uncertainty of boundary lines and land titles, continued without serious interruption until the great floods of 1906. In that year, the Colorado almost bodily left its old outlet to the Gulf, cut a new channel through the heart of the Imperial Valley, and poured its waters into the vast inland sink since known as Salton Sea. For many dangerous weeks, the rising waters threatened to engulf the ranches and settlements of the valley, and destruction seemed to await the whole imperial project. The closing of the breach through which the river had escaped was a task of too great magnitude for the California Development Company or the settlers of the valley. The aid of the federal government and the full strength of the Southern Pacific Railroad, whose through line east was menaced by the Runaway River, was accordingly given to meet the emergency. Fortunately, in the person of Eppes Randolph, one of the genuine pioneer railroad builders of the Southwest, a man was found capable of dealing with the situation. The struggle went desperately on during the summer and fall of 1906, while the people of the valley waited with deep anxiety the advent of the winter and spring floods. Twice at least, when the rains came earlier than had been expected, the Colorado got beyond control. But in February 1907, the last break was closed, and the river resumed its fretful way to the Gulf. Once released from the menace of the Colorado, the Imperial Valley underwent a transformation tritely spoken of as amazing. The fertility of the soil, coupled with the intense heat of the summers and the mild winter climate, produced enormous crops of almost every variety. Barley, sorghum, milo, maize, and alfalfa, early vegetables such as lettuce, tomatoes, and peas, cotton, corn, cattle, and hogs, milk, butter, eggs, and turkeys for the Thanksgiving and Christmas markets, grapes that ripen before the frost is well out of the ground in New England, and a cantaloupe harvest so large that a day's pick from a single shipping center often fills 200 freight cars. Such today are the products of Imperial Valley, where 2 short decades or a little more ago were only desert waste and sand. Though occupying a much less spectacular position in California's economic life than at an earlier time, mining has consistently remained one of the state's important industries since the great gold era of 1849. At present, there are approximately 50 minerals developed on a commercial scale, but the production of gold, chiefly by quartz mining and dredging, remains the most important feature of the industry, if petroleum be excluded. Silver, quicksilver, copper, borax, cement, and building stone are also produced in considerable quantities. The lumber industry, which very early in the history of the state became one of its important assets, remains today a characteristic feature of California's economic life. The industry is localized chiefly in the Sierra Nevada mountains of central and northern California, and in the coast counties north of the Russian River. The world's supply of commercial redwood, a beautiful decay-resisting timber, comes from the 4 counties of Santa Cruz, Humboldt, Mendocino, and Del Norte. The redwood cut equals nearly 500 million board feet a year. Next comes western yellow pine, with an annual production of about 400 million feet. Douglas fir, about 225 million feet. Sugar pine and white fir, nearly 125 million feet each, and cedar, spruce, and other minor woods sufficient to raise the total annual output to over 1,500,000,000 board feet. One of the great natural resources has been denied to California. The state has no known coal deposits of any magnitude. This lack of fuel for a long time proved a serious handicap to the development of cheap and efficient transportation and to the establishment of important manufactures. 2 other agencies, however, the one especially in comparatively recent times, have been drawn upon to make up for this deficiency of coal. These are petroleum and hydroelectric energy. The history of the petroleum industry in California, fascinating as it is, must be passed by with only a meager and unsatisfactory reference. Oil exudes were found near Los Angeles over 100 years ago, and the asphaltum which they produced was made use of to cover the roofs of early Spanish California houses. The beginning of commercial production of petroleum in the Pennsylvania fields drew some attention in the early 60s to the possibilities of developing these oil deposits in California, and about this time the first commercial production is said to have been obtained in Pico Canyon near the present town of Newhall. But no important development took place until the late 70s. Thomas R. Bard, afterwards the United States Senator from California, Lyman Stewart, now chairman of the board of directors of the Union Oil Company, and W. L. Hardison were among the most important pioneers in the industry. Early in the 90s, E. L. Doheny, now prominently identified with petroleum development in Mexico, and his partner, C. A. Canfield, began the production of oil in the Los Angeles fields by sinking a shaft with pick, shovel, and windlass on a plot of ground near the western boundary of the city. In those early years, petroleum was valuable chiefly for the manufacture of kerosene and axle grease. Then the possibility of using crude oil for fuel became known, and sometime later it began to be used on locomotives instead of coal. From an economic standpoint, this was an invaluable aid to the development of transportation in California, for the oil-burning locomotives solved the expensive and perplexing fuel problem of the railroads. Since the ever-increasing demand for gasoline and lubricants caused by the growth of the automobile industry and the larger use of crude petroleum for fuel and transportation and manufacturing, the oil deposits of California have become one of the state's greatest assets. The chief producing fields lie in Kern, Orange, Fresno, Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, and Ventura counties. The development of hydroelectric power, which is said to have been begun in California by the Chaffee brothers of Ontario in 1882, has come to be, especially in the last decade, one of the outstanding features of the state's new industrial life. The Sierra Nevada mountains, with their abundant snows and never-failing streams, furnish a vast storehouse of power upon which the state can draw for its future industrial and transportation needs. Many of the largest rivers of the state, such as the Pitt, Klamath, Feather, San Joaquin, Kings, Kern, and Owens, have already been partially harnessed and made to furnish light and power for the cities, homes, street railways, manufacturing plants, and irrigation works in the valleys below. Most of this development has been carried on by a few large public utility corporations, of which the Southern California Edison, the Pacific Gas and Electric, the San Joaquin Light and Power, the Western States Electric, and the Southern Sierras Power Company are the most important. But the cities of Los Angeles and San Francisco have also entered the hydroelectric field. Los Angeles has centered its activities in the Owens River Valley and along the 230-mile aqueduct which carries the water of that stream to the city. In 1920, the municipal power plants were producing close to 85,000 horsepower, and the city was definitely committed to the policy of generating and distributing its own electric energy. San Francisco, though not as yet actually supplying its citizens with light or power, has undertaken to build an aqueduct from the Hetch Hetchy Valley, which lies some distance above Yosemite, to secure an adequate water supply, and will shortly have its power plants in operation as an integral part of that enterprise. In 1920, the hydroelectric plants of California supplied approximately 1 million horsepower, but this marks only the beginning of the industry and probably represents less than 1/4 of the state's potential capacity, an estimate which does not include the vast resources of the Colorado River, to which Southern California is already looking as an additional source of power. The use of petroleum and the development of hydroelectric energy, as already indicated, have in recent years made possible the creation of an industrial life formerly regarded as impossible for California. Other factors, such as an abundant supply of raw materials, shipping and transportation facilities, ever-widening markets, favorable conditions of labor and for labor, and the rare advantages offered by nature in the way of climate, have also played an important part in this new feature of the state's economic life. The results of the federal census of 1920 are not yet available in detail for an adequate survey of California's industrial growth since 1910. Sufficient material, however, is at hand to show at least the broad features of this progress. In 1899, California had 4,000 997 manufacturing establishments, which employed 72,224 persons and represented a capital investment of $175,468,000, with a total output valued at $257,386,000. In 1914, there were 10,057 establishments employing 139,481 persons, representing a capital investment of $736,106,000 and having a total output of $712,801,000. According to the preliminary figures of 1919, the number of establishments had risen in that year to 11,942, and the number of persons employed to 243,000. A total of $1,333,382,000 was invested in California manufactures, and the value of the yearly production came to $1,981,410,000, or an increase of approximately 6,700% in 20 years. The development of transportation facilities has kept pace with the industrial and agricultural progress of the state. The history of the steam railroad building has already been dwelt upon in previous chapters and need not be repeated here. Nearly 3,000 miles of electric road are also now in operation in California, serving the local needs of the chief cities and the demands of interurban transportation. Chief of these citizens is that of the Pacific Electric Railway Company, originally built by Henry E. Huntington, but now a subsidiary of the Southern Pacific Company. This line, with its center in Los Angeles, has not only knit the surrounding cities into a compact community with a larger city, made possible the upbuilding of hundreds of square miles of rural territory, and furnished easy access to the beaches and mountains for the city's population, but has also prevented, perhaps as much as any other agency, the development of a congested tenement and slum district in Los Angeles by enabling the wage earner and small salaried man to own his own home in one of the many subdivisions which have sprung up along the company's various lines. Passenger and commercial automobiles, it is a truism to remark, have also worked a revolution in the development of transportation throughout the state. The 2,800 miles of paved highways in California have become a great drawing card for the eastern tourist. They have also furnished the means for developing a huge freight and passenger business by means of automobile trucks and commercial stages. Best of all, they have encouraged travel among the people of the state, and thereby vastly widened the horizons of pleasure, added to culture, strengthened the spirit of unity, and bred an appreciation deeper than ever before of California's resources, beauty, and charm. With the state's material progress along other lines, there is no space to deal, and only a few bare figures can be used to sum up the results of this great economic advance. In 1920, the 5 wealthiest counties of the state, in order named, were Los Angeles, with an assessed valuation of $1,275,751,000, San Francisco, city and county, $818,074,000, Alameda, $302,649,000, Fresno, $169,426,000, and Sacramento, $130,162,000. Bank assets totaled $2,440,487,000. Exports and imports, to the value of $487 million, passed through the chief ports. Among the states of the Union, California ranked 8th in population, 5th in banking capital, 4th in general agriculture, fell a few thousand barrels short of holding her accustomed first place in the petroleum industry, and surpassed all her competitors in the output of gold and horticultural products. As one scans the figures cited in this chapter, his mind recalls the old predictions of William Shaler, Richard Henry Dana, Waddy Thompson, Thomas O. Larkin, and the other early prophets of California's future. Yet today's prosperity and achievements surpass the destiny these enthusiasts foretold. The Californian, in very truth, is a citizen of no mean state. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30, A History of California, the American Period, by Robert Class Cleland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30, Review and Prophecy. As the writing of this history draws to a close, the mind instinctively looks backward over those eventful years with which the volume deals. In this brief survey, one sees first the faint awakenings of American interest in the Spanish province of Alta California. The New England merchants traffic again along the sunlit, poorly guarded coast. The shadow of Russia hangs for a moment over San Francisco Bay. The hide and tallow vessels laboriously collect their cargoes at every little port. Smith and the Patees pioneer a way across the continent. The first adventurous immigrants wind wearily down the mountain trails, and John C. Fremont fights his slow passage through the Sierra snows. Then the scene changes. Jackson and Tyler have already pressed their futile negotiations upon the Mexican Republic for the province. Larkin seeks to bend the disaffection of the native leaders to the interests of his government. English ambitions hold a threat of danger to the program of the United States. The Sacramento settlers raise the crude bear flag as a symbol of revolt. And finally, a strong-willed president acquires California as the fruit of war. The gold rush follows, a tumultuous beginning for the new day. Statehood, then, and a time of social and political adjustment, when a restless people seek to accommodate themselves to ordered government and the restraints of law. Vigorously, too, they give themselves to the greater task of making nature serve the purposes of man. They fill the treasury of the world with gold, reclaim an empire from the wilderness, turn the rivers into useful channels, meet the challenge of the mountains with a railroad, and securely lay the material foundations for a splendid state. Upon this foundation later generations build. How swiftly and successfully the preceding chapter but just now sought to show. So much for the past of California. What of her future? Of the state's increasing economic progress throughout the coming years, there can be no doubt. So long, at least, as her mineral resources last, her soil retains its fertility, and nature takes no unwarranted liberties with her climate. Along less material lines, the promise of the future is no less attractive. The last few years, especially, have witnessed a surprising growth of culture and education among the people of California, and an increasing emphasis upon the agencies which make for these things. Art galleries, libraries, and museums, either privately endowed or provided for from public funds, are being erected in ever larger numbers. Education, too, in the generally accepted sense of that word, has become almost a passion throughout California. The public school system, using the term to include all branches of education supported by the state, has justly acquired a fame of national and even international scope. Except in very sparsely settled regions, the old-fashioned schoolhouses, unsightly and poorly built as generally they were, have been replaced by buildings architecturally beautiful and thoroughly equipped to minister to the comfort and efficiency of the students. Whether grammar school or high school, in rural communities or in the largest cities, these attractive buildings, which so impress chance visitors to the state, stand as unmistakable evidence of the place education holds in public favor from one end of California to the other. Of colleges, universities, and technical schools, the state has also many splendid examples, but in recent years the facilities of these institutions of higher learning have been sadly overtaxed to care for the students seeking entrance. The State University at Berkeley, founded nearly 3/4 of a century ago by a handful of earnest men under old Dr. Willie's leadership, has grown to be the largest university in the United States. At Palo Alto, Stanford University, established by Mr. and Mrs. Leland Stanford as a memorial to their son, long since won and still maintains a distinctive place in national educational life. The University of Southern California, situated in Los Angeles, and now having a total enrollment of over 5,000 students, stands as an abiding testimonial to the early Methodist belief in higher education. Smaller institutions of a high-grade collegiate character are Mills College near Oakland, the only women's college in the state; Pomona College at Claremont, founded under Congregational direction; and Occidental College, located about midway between the center of Los Angeles and Pasadena, a school of Presbyterian origin and traditions. The California Institute of Technology, situated in Pasadena, is an engineering school exceptionally well equipped and giving promise of great attainments in various fields of science. The Lick Observatory on Mount Hamilton in Northern California and the even more renowned Carnegie Solar Observatory on Mount Wilson near Los Angeles enjoy an international reputation for their part in broadening the knowledge of astronomy. The Golden Gate Museum in San Francisco, the Los Angeles County Collection at Exposition Park, and the Southwest Museum, also of Los Angeles, are making valuable contributions in the field of art, history, and science. Most of the cities and counties of California maintain public libraries of an excellent type. In Northern California, the State Library at Sacramento and the libraries of Stanford University and the University of California are of outstanding importance. In Southern California, the Los Angeles Public Library, so long serving a great need with efficiency and success, though poorly and inadequately housed, will shortly have a handsome and fitting building of its own. The Henry E. Huntington Library and Art Gallery near Pasadena, the unique benefaction of Mr. Henry E. Huntington to the Southern California public, has already attained an international fame because of its priceless art and literary treasures and the rare beauty of its building. To the realm of literature, California has already made certain noteworthy contributions. Of these, the works of Mark Twain, Bret Harte, Helen Hunt Jackson, John Muir, Frank Norris, and Jack London are perhaps the best examples. Among the nation's poets, the names of Joaquin Miller and Edwin Markham are not unknown. Hubert Howe Bancroft and Theodore H. Hittel, during their lifetime, achieved a distinctive and permanent reputation in the realm of history. But the newer school of historians, with its center at the University of California, and to a lesser degree at Stanford, bids fair to win an even larger fame. Indeed, in nearly every field of literature, as also in painting, sculpture, and music, California's greatness lies ahead rather than in the past. Though the prophecy lacks the pleasing feature of novelty, it at least contains the virtue of truth, that as these arts came to their full fruition under the warm skies of Greece and Italy many centuries ago, so here in California they will sometime flourish with all the vigor and beauty they enjoyed in those earlier lands. The Panama Pacific Exposition at San Francisco in 1915 and the Panama California Exposition at San Diego in the same year gave tangible evidence of the growing influence of this aesthetic spirit in the state. There is, too, in California, with all its vigorous life and earnest purpose, a recognition of the value of leisure and wholesome recreation that modern society sadly needs. Here there is unlimited opportunity for outdoor pleasure. In few other states is it possible for motoring, tennis, and golf to be so universally indulged in by families of moderate means. The seashore, especially the numerous resorts from Santa Barbara to San Diego, furnishes a vast all-year playground for the people. The Coast Range and Sierra Madre Mountains, and to a much greater degree the Sierra Nevada, are a vacation ground for tens of thousands of Californians annually. Who shall say what it means to the welfare of a state if even the smallest fraction of its population can stand on such a spot as Glacier Point and see spread out before them a panorama too full of splendor to be described, of mountains and snow and sunlit peaks. The Yosemite Valley, Lake Tahoe, Giant Forest, General Grant Park, the Feather River region, and the Humboldt County Redwoods are all easy of access and internationally known. But no less wonderful for scenery and of even greater attraction to the more primitive lover of outdoor life are those regions beyond the reach of ordinary tourists, through which run the headwaters of such great rivers as the Kern, the Kings, and the San Joaquin. From many other aspects, life in California also holds peculiar distinction and attractiveness. Small towns and ranch communities are so closely linked to one another and to the larger cities by paved highways, electric railway lines, and telephones. So many labor-saving devices are in use in the homes of these communities, and such a high standard of prosperity obtains among the agricultural population that the oppressive handicaps of isolation and drudgery, so long associated with rural life, have in large measure been abolished. California cities, too, are fortunately seldom so congested and cramped for room as eastern cities, and the tenement problem, consequently, is not so common or acute. For persons of moderate or even modest means, the typical dwelling is the bungalow, built in any one of 1,000 different styles, and nearly always in a setting of flower gardens, shrubbery, and lawns. Altogether, therefore, the citizens of California today enjoy a prosperity, an attractiveness of life, and cultural opportunities probably greater than those to be found among any other people. But these advantages are not all clear gain, and in certain of them, at least, may lie the springs of serious danger. It is more or less a maxim of history that increase in wealth tends to stifle the spirit of democracy and soften the fiber of a people. The stability of California, as of the nation itself, rests upon the broad shoulders of the middle class. Only so long, therefore, as the great body of her citizens remain true to the old American virtues and to the old American traditions, will the state's security be assured. In the luxury and ease of modern life, in the spread of lax ideas regarding morality and the sacredness of law, in the increasing demand for government to do for the individual what previously he has willingly done for himself, there are unmistakable evidences of danger. Nor is this all. The unprecedented industrial development of the last few years, the disappearance of cheap land, and the rapid growth of an urban population have already brought to California the perplexing labor problems of the older states. Not as yet so aggravated or difficult to deal with as in older communities, the issues between capital and labor must, sooner or later, be solved in California, however, as in the nation at large, by justice and reason on either side, or they will destroy the very foundations of the social order. Other problems also present themselves. By origin and tradition, California is essentially an Anglo-Saxon state. Her people, as yet, are still largely of American stock, and hold fast to the American ideals of home, family, government, and religion. Today, however, currents of foreign blood are emptying into the mainstream. California not only faces an Oriental problem, the danger of which to the superficial observer seems to rise and fall according to the proximity or remoteness of a political election, but also has in some respects the more serious task of assimilating an increasing number of un-Americanized Europeans. Most of these belong to the laboring population, but others rank higher in the social scale. So long, however, as the standards and ideals of a foreigner run counter to the fundamental traditions of this country, it makes scant difference whether he is literate or illiterate, a laborer or a millionaire. His presence under any condition constitutes an evil to the nation and to the state. Indeed, in some respects, the most serious problem now faced by the United States is how to remain American. California as yet has not felt the full pressure of this issue, but with a rapid economic development and the ever-increasing foreign immigration, using that term in a sense broad enough to include all those who are out of sympathy with the fundamental traditions of this country, she will soon be called upon to guard her heritage as an American state from perversion and extinction. It is altogether likely that this will prove her most difficult task. Such as are some of the problems which the future holds in store for California. They are no longer the problems of a frontier state, for California has long since outgrown the pioneer age with its discomforts and simplicity, its crudeness and open-handedness, its provincialism and freedom from conventionality, its lack of so much that we today regard as essential to the higher art of living, and its vigorous individualism, and has adapted herself to the changed conditions of the modern day. Her problems, accordingly, are the complex problems of a highly civilized, cultured, prosperous people. But the same strong spirit that 3/4 of a century ago pushed across the continent, transformed a Mexican province into an American state, and gave to that state boldness and vigor and wealth and ideals, will solve these newer problems also. So long as that spirit lives and the fear of God remains in the hearts of her people, the destiny and greatness of California are assured. End of chapter 30. End of A History of California, the American Period, by Robert Glass Cleland.